Right, I'd like to get moving here so that we can try and stay on time this evening. So I'd like to call the committee to order. And welcome to all the panel members, public in the audience, and any media in attendance. And I want to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on traditional Treaty 6 territory and Métis homeland. So once again, I'd like to welcome Elder Russell Auger to our meeting. He has joined us at a previous meeting. Elder Auger is from Big Stone Cree Nation and is currently the resident elder at Ambrose Place. He works with the Creating Hope Society and has presented extensively across North America on Indigenous culture and healing. Elder Auger has graciously worked with the Ministries of Children's Services and Community and Social Services to support events and training sessions in the past, including a blanket exercise training and family finding boot camp. So I will now turn it over to Elder Auger to get us going.
Thank you very much. I'm truly honored with the fact of what happened here. In our culture, there's right now sundances and the ceremonies are happening right now. And there's a young lady that asked me to go support her. She's on her Sundance journey right now. I'll probably be going there tomorrow to support her. But the bigger support that I believe that needs to happen is when we talk about leadership in the history of our people, it was the elders that were recognized in terms of the leaders.
Oh, it's Greg Clark. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you. I think the room is muted.
Can you hear me now, sir? Are you still there?
Greg, can you hear?
We'll work with them right away.
Okay. Now do I have to start over? And when I mentioned the way the protocol works in terms of our way, it's the elders that sit in that position of lead. And that's not to say that they're going to come and take over whatever community is. The community will come to them whenever situations occur and they need help. It hasn't happened so much in today's world, but in the history of our world, that's what was existing. And it was a priority. When you ask for going into communities, I'll give you a little story in the history of what I went to one time. I was at Assumption, which is probably called differently now, different name they gave it, Chate. And when I was there, they had a conflict in their community. And they called all the community members and they had chief and council in front making decision, trying to make decision. And what happened was all the community members were attacking chief and council about the policies and procedures of what was going on in the community. And there was lots of bitterness and lots of arguing and lots of unhealthy feelings in the hall. And there were two young fellas sitting in front of the hall, in front, listening to all this stuff going on, and there were all the elders sitting in the back there listening and watching all this stuff go on. And one of the young fellas talked to the other young fellow and says, you know what, we should go ask one of the elders to come and speak. Maybe he'll give word, give information and knowledge. So he rushed over there and he sat by the elder and he says, Muslim. In our language, Muslim is Muslim means grandfather. He says, Muslim, would you speak on our behalf because there's so much going on here and it's affecting everybody negatively. Maybe you can speak and calm things down. And the elder didn't say anything, and the young fellow went and sat back down. The elder didn't get up, didn't say anything, he just sat there, watched. And the other young fellow said to him, did you give the old man protocol? Oh, I forgot to, he said. I forgot to give the old man protocol. And our way tobacco comes first, and the other young fellow ran rushing over there, and he presented him some tobacco. He says, Muslim, we have to apologize. We forgot to bring protocol, and we still want you to come and speak. Would you come up, just go up and speak for us? So the young man went running back, and about 10 minutes later, the old man stood up. When the old man stood up, the whole room went silent. And the old man started to speak. And when he started to speak, he started to talk about all the things that were going on in the history of their community, from all the years of probably 60, 70 years back about how community ran and how things worked. and how all the conflicts and all the situations that occurred and how they did things in the past. and how they govern their systems and how they work together. That old man spoke for about an hour straight. And nobody once interfered and nobody once said anything to that old man, because what that old man was telling the truth about community, about what the children raised like, what the in the community were carrying on. So I tell you that from experience about what we as a people have done, and we've always done. When you sit in these rooms and you start to have consultation, you have to make decisions about how things should be operating about our children. Some of the things need to be asked of our people themselves, because they know what our communities are like, and they know what our children are about, and they know what those families are about, and they know what the problems are out in the communities. So those leaders that we speak about are the ones that have been there long enough to experience and have knowledge about many experiences about how making change would be effective. So I say that to you in the most humblest way that I can, because everywhere I need to go, I ask for other older elders to come and ask when I need help. I say, Muslim, I don't know what to do, because I got to go to this community. They're asking me to come and talk about, violence. They're asking me to come and talk about sexual abuse in their community. They're asking me to do all kinds of things when I go to the community, but I need your help because I don't know what's going on when I go there. What do I need to do, Muslim? Can you tell me? And then they talk to me. Sometimes they'll tell me a story for an hour, and then I have to catch the story. What's the story mean? That's why I tell you a story. Because all you have hearts here, and all you have to make some decisions that are going to be tough decisions. They're going to be decisions that you, as a group of people here, have to decide what's the best for those children, how things are going to work for those children. But I know back home there's lots of conflict, and there's still lots of unhealthiness. And there's lots of things that need to be repaired. In our language, there's no such word as sin. In our language in Cree, there's no word for sin. In our language, the closest thing to our language to sin is shattering a child's dreams. That's what sin is for us in our language. That's the only word that they can find closest to sin in our language. So you need to figure out, what are you going to create those dreams and hopes of those children that are lost now, the ones that are having problems and the ones that we've lost, and those families that have been affected by stuff like that there. So I'm grateful for you asking me to share a little bit, and I could probably talk here for 2 days, but you guys got to talk for yourselves. So I thank you very much for letting me speak a little bit. Okay. You guys have a good panel. And if I can, I'll come back when you guys are finishing up. I'll close with you. You said on the 12th, right?
Yeah, I think so. I don't remember the schedule, but
Well,
the department will keep you in the loop.
okay, yeah, just let me know.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You guys have a good day. Thank you very much.
Anybody home? Is there anybody home?
Yeah, Cam's here.
Thank you so much, Elder. We've got some sound glitches happening here. So we do have MLA Cameron Westhead, MLA Jason Nixon, MLA Rick McIver, MLA Dr. Swan, and MLA Greg Clark are all joining via teleconference. Are you all with us? Can you hear me?
They can't.
They can't hear me?
We're still trying to figure that out.
Okay.
We'll keep going.
You're going to keep working on it? All right. As always, we welcome and encourage the public to attend and observe our panel meetings, and we ask anybody joining us today, if they wish to provide input on what the panel is discussing, to please complete the panel submission form that was handed out, or complete the online discussion guide, which is now posted on the panel's website. You can always send an email to cipanel.questions@gov.ab.ca, either from the laptops outside of this room or at another time. This meeting is being audio live streamed to the panel website, which is at childinterventionpanel.alberta.ca. At the last meeting, we heard an overview from Children's Services staff on child intervention and evidence-based practice, continuous improvement processes and service delivery, and the workload assessment model. Today, we have the benefit to hear again from Children's Services staff on major strategic policy initiatives in Children's Services relating to past recommendations. We have the honor of hearing from Dr. Choate on past recommendations, learnings, and potential impacts resulting in shifts in practice. And we'll then take a short dinner break and return to hear from Children's Services staff on the child intervention workforce, workplace culture, and staff morale. And then we'll close our day with a brief facilitated discussion guided by Damien Travers, and we'll look at our agenda for our next meeting. So before we move into to introduce our presenters, I'd like to just quickly go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. Starting on my left.
Hello, I'm Graham Such. I'm the MLA for Calgary Shaw.
Patty Lavacan Benson.
Peter Choate from Mount Royal University.
Heather Sweet, Edmonton Manning.
Bruce McLaurin, University of Calgary.
Joni Brodziak with the Ministry of Children's Services.
Sarita Gay-Bramo with the Ministry of Children's Services.
Tyler White, Siksika Nation.
Maria Fitzpatrick, Lethbridge East.
Nicole Goring, Edmonton Castle Downs.
And I'm Debbie Jabour, MLA for Peace River and chair of the panel. And do we have anybody on the phone yet? Not yet. Okay. Well, we know who you are, so whenever we get you, we'll move on to our presentation then with... Can they hear us now? All right. Those on the phone, would you like to quickly introduce yourselves? Okay, I heard Calgary Hayes. Anyone else?
Anyone else?
Cameron Weston, MLA Beth Corcoran.
Okay, who are we still missing?
Davis, Long, Green, Clark, Jason, Cameron West.
Okay, so we've got Cameron, we've got Rick, Jason. No, David?
And two other folks.
And Greg?
Two other participants.
Okay. Well, we're hopeful that you can hear us. We'll have to just continue on and we'll take it from there. So I'd like to introduce Sarita to please get us going.
Sure, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Choate.
Yeah, so I'm actually getting us started.
You're getting us started.
Yes.
Okay.
So what we're, Sarita's going to go first, but if you put this in, what we're going to do this afternoon into context, you recall that we came together because of the case of Sarita, or not, Serenity. What we're doing today, though, is we're looking at what comes out of analysis of cases like Serenity's, but rather than an N of one, we're looking at a much larger thematic consideration of the various reviews that have taken place around the child intervention system. So, Sarita, you're on.
Sure. Oh, is this close enough?
No.
Can you hear? No. Okay, cord's not long enough. We're going to swing down the
Here,
There's that one right on your left.
There we go. Is that better?
You gotta almost get it right.
How about now? Okay.
Pretend you're talking to your kids.
Yeah, I don't use a mic for that. I don't need one. All right, so thanks for having me back in phase 2. If you remember, I did come talk about the approach in phase 1. I am a very fast talker, so I will try to slow down my best. But if you find I'm getting away from you, please cue me because I'm a little used to that as well. You received, just before I start, I just want to talk about you received a ton of material in your package. So I just want to walk and unpack that a little bit. So you received one very large package, which included all 331 recommendations from the last 10 fiscal years. So those are every formal recommendation we have received. You have a thematic analysis of how that fits that I'm going to walk you through. What the status of that implementation is as of December 31st, 2016, and our outcomes based on our implementation of the recommendation. To support you with all the information we gave you, we also pulled out from that in a strict cut and paste all the ones that are active, so whatever is ongoing or in progress, so that you wouldn't have to flip through the hundreds of pages. And then we further elevated the ones that are not applicable because we knew that was an interest last time we were here. So you can see an assessment of what was not accepted versus what was not intended for the ministry, just to bring that to the surface. You also received just a Word document on a thematic analysis overview, taking you through our themes and our process and our numbers and kind of breaking that down. And so my PowerPoint is intended to unpack that kind of dense material for you. So I'm hoping that that's where we get to today. And then Dr. Choate will present after. So if we have the PowerPoint up. Carla, if you have the PowerPoint. I'll keep going. So our focus today is to look at, just remind you again about the Children's Services Recommendation Approach, go through our thematic analysis and progress status, and then talk to you about our recommendation actioning, how we're sequencing and implementing those in our larger practice initiatives to demonstrate how we're moving our system forward based on these systemic recommendations. So there are, again, a number of recommending bodies that provide formal recommendations to the ministry. Our definition of formal recommendation is recommendations released into the public that require some level of response from us. That doesn't negate the other types of recommendations we receive that have other mechanisms in place. So there are typical bodies that we have are the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate, Fatality Inquiries, Council for Quality Assurance, the Implementation Oversight Committee from 2014-15, the Alberta College of Social Workers, other systemic reviews that have occurred in the past, such as the CI review or the external panel, and statutory reviews. So our approach was developed in 2014 based on the work and recommendations of the Implementation Oversight Committee and some work that had already been undertaken at the ministry level. That approach, starting on slide 4, just as we get it queued up here. That approach was developed by completing a jurisdictional scan, conducting some research into models that were in existence, such as SMART, Double SMART, and CLEAR. We worked with the IOC, the Council for Quality Assurance, and the Advocate on our process and implementation. So if you go to the next slide, I don't know if we have a clicker so I can click them, but the next slide is that large overview schematic, and you would have seen this in phase 1. So this takes you through that process when we receive a report. So we receive it, we review that with internal and partner subject matter experts on the recommendation to take a look at what would be some of the impacts on our system in implementing that, what would be the levers we would be pulling, and does this fit within our trajectory or not, and what considerations do we need. Then from a collaborative standpoint, we go back when we meet with the recommending body. We want to make sure that we're really clear on the intended outcome of the recommendation. Sometimes recommending bodies write their recommendations in the way that the ministry doesn't quite clearly understand, and so we want to make sure we're driving to the same outcome for systemic improvement. Once we have that, we start to sit back and develop an action plan that would meet that outcome, draft a public response, draft an action plan with clear, actionable items that can be evidence-based. We move that public response forward for approval from the minister, and then we post it publicly. We begin tracking our recommendations from that point forward once they're posted publicly with our acceptance or non-acceptance of the recommendation. Our database is based on the collection of the report, our response to the report, actions we've committed to, a logging of actions we take every 6 months, and evidence to prove that that action happened. So no action goes into the database that doesn't have a tangible piece of evidence to demonstrate we did it. So that level of evidence actually came from a corporate internal audit service that happened in 2015 as a result of the IOC. What they wanted to do was have confidence that we were evaluating our recommendations consistently and appropriately and evidence-based. So they looked at 56 of the 58 recommendations that the IOC had evaluated that were either considered complete by the ministry or ongoing or systemic in nature. When they did their evaluation, they confirmed status on 6 of the 58. For 2 of those recommendations, one was partially verified, and it was related specifically to the implementation of the Sheldon Kennedy Centre. Because the relationship had not been completely formalized between the Calgary Police Services, Alberta Health Services, and Children's Services at the Sheldon Kennedy Centre, it was considered only partially verified. Subsequently, the Sheldon Kennedy Centre is in operation, so it would be considered verified. The other recommendation was a process enacted by Human Services HR at the time, but it was marked draft because it was continued to be an iterative process, and because of the draft watermark, the audit service would not consider it validated. So through the Corporate Internal Audit Service and a lot of wonderful hours with some great evaluators, we got 3 more recommendations. So recommendations about recommendations. They wanted us to continue to adopt the SMART approach that we'd already elected to take based on our research. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely recommendations. They wanted us to establish a formal data management system for recommendation logging and tracking, which we were in the process of doing. And they asked us to be very clear when we receive a recommendation that is outside the scope of our ministry, to be clear about our non-acceptance. What they found in our audit was, because we were responding to the reports we received, regardless of who the recommendation was meant for, we were then in the position of having to prove what we said in response to the recommendation was something the ministry had done, even though the recommendation wasn't for us. It was a bit of a infinite loop. So since that time in late 2015, we've adopted the 5 categories that were evaluated by the Corporate Internal Audit Service and the Implementation Oversight Committee. So those are implemented or complete, that actions have been taken to support the implementation of the outcome of the REC. Ongoing, these recommendations take year-over-year action. We call them our larger systemic movers. In progress, these are typically far more tactical, and we talked about this last time. It's revise a policy, make something clearer in a procedural manual, revise and update a handbook for caregivers. Not applicable, which can be one of 2 things. Either it's not accepted because the ministry has something alternate in place, or it's not applicable because it was never intended for children's services. And then our final category is pending. So a pending recommendation is one that we're actively working on developing an action plan, collaborating with the recommending body to make sure we understand their outcome, or we're developing and drafting the public response. So that takes us to here and today. We have received well over 500 formal recommendations since 1999. All 500 and some of those recommendations are in the database with their associated actions and evidence to demonstrate the actions occurred. For the purposes of the panel, we were looking at a 10-year span from the fiscal year 2006-7 to December 31st, 2016. That equals out to 331 formal recommendations. And you can see by the chart on the screen in the package that you have, the bulk of those recommendations come from the Advocate's Office. Then next is fatality inquiries, and then we have Council for Quality Assurance, systemic reviews, Implementation Oversight Committee, and the College of Social Workers. So if we move to this, when we look at those 331 and we dissect them out further into statuses, you can see that over 50% or 56% are implemented, meaning we've taken the actions to implement the outcome or implement a strategy, a policy, a procedure that meets the intent. We have 30 ongoing and 28 in progress, or a total of 18% that we're actively pursuing. There are 12% that are pending, meaning we're drafting, collaborating, or in the process of waiting for public response. And we have 14% that are not applicable. For the not applicable, there's 45 recommendations out of the 33. 32 of those were not intended at all for the ministry, so they are not cross-ministry collaboration. They are for other ministries, agencies, or organizations. A bulk of those come from fatality inquiries, and a few of them are from the Advocate's Office. An example would be in 17-year-old Catherine, the investigative review. There were 2 recommendations directed specifically to Alberta Health Services. There are 13 recommendations overall from the 331 that were not accepted at the time they were made by Children's Services. So for example, in a recent fatality inquiry, it was recommended that Children's Services retain a physician to support caregivers and caseworkers with sudden infant death syndrome. We had other mechanisms in place around mandatory medical referrals, follow-ups, and other policies and procedures with caregivers, so we did not feel it prudent to retain a specific physician. There were other recommendations made around organizational changes, such as the dissolution of the Child and Family Services Authority boards. At the time that recommendation was made, we had undergone another similar review where the Child Family Service Authority boards were considered value added in their communities, and so we chose not to accept that recommendation. Subsequently, the Child Family Services Authority Act is no longer in existence, so that would be considered complete, ironically. So of the 500 recommendations, what we started to look at was we were uncomfortable with trying to pull one-on-one levers. If you look at the numbers of recommendations coming, we have anywhere from 20 to 60 in a year. If you think of a workforce of couple thousand child intervention services workers, 4,000 plus agency workers, thousands of caregivers. If you had to pull the lever and make 20 changes this year, 40 changes this year, 60 changes this year, it would be a little crazy to try to figure out Monday to Friday when you come to work, what do I actually do today? So what we did is we sat back and we did some cross-jurisdictional analysis on other reports received across Canada, across the States, UK and Australia, whether they were tragic events, reviews of systems, and we tried to look for general themes that could be used. And so we came up with these 5 themes. They're related to governance, information sharing, cross-ministry collaboration, program development and delivery, and human resources and staffing. This theming supports the intervention in responding to similar recommendations based on a common theme with consistent evidenced actions in a collective manner. So now when we take those 331 recommendations and we look at them in thematic groups, you can see that overwhelmingly the majority of recommendations made are in the program development delivery area. The next most common area is the not applicable because the majority of recs are not for us. So for active recommendations, it would be cross-ministry collaboration. So if I go through the 5 themes and unpack them for you, the governance is really focused on leadership, oversight on implementing change, and revisions to operational requirements or decisions. There have been 29 of those to date, and a lot of them are actually legislative in nature. Information sharing, there have 18 recommendations to date. Those ones are really focused on documentation requirements and improved communication internally or externally with stakeholders. And they talk about trending and assessing information to support learning opportunities that influence policy and practice. Cross-ministry collaboration and partnership, there's been 42 of the 331. These are really around requiring collaboration with other ministries and agencies to support the implementation and reap the fullest benefit of recommending bodies' intent on impacting service delivery. So this is seamless service delivery, appropriate transition between one program to another, supporting youth in transitioning successfully to adult services, and supporting Indigenous families. The most common areas mentioned is program development and delivery. This is really about addressing root causes and the need for intervention to begin with. This is about kinship residential placements, policy and practice revisions, enhancements, and supports. These ones are also about supporting clients in self-advocacy and improving services to children, youth, cultural connections, intentional assessment, case planning, and meeting the unique needs of each child and family coming to our door. For staffing and human resources, we've themed 19 recommendations. This is really related to performance, supporting staff through tragic events, and training. See, my clicker is engaged in a conversation off to the side. So if we break that down one more time, the 331, you can see that 249 of them would be considered implemented and active. So that's the majority of the recommendations, again, over 75%. This is where the actions have been taken already, and we're in the process of evaluating and continuous improvement, or we're in the process of implementing actively, so we're developing processes, we're enhancing services or tools. The not applicable, and this could be a bit of a mental gymnastics here, because this is a dynamic system at the time of the pull, there were 4 recommendations in the system that had not been publicly approved, that we had gone in and themed, and so the numbers shift on this one, and I don't want people to freak out about the 4 recs. It's not a substantive change, but it is because of the date and time stamp that happened as we pulled the information out of the system. So the numbers get changed by 4, and I've had lots of conversations about how that happened with my clicker person. So if we go to the next slide, this just breaks down the 58 active and the 187 implemented, and you can see that we have a continuous theme going here. So again, the majority of implemented and the majority of the ones that are active are really focused on program development and delivery. The next most common after that is the cross-ministry collaboration, which isn't surprising. And then after that, we have a little bit of variance between implemented, the next most important being information sharing versus what we're currently actively working on, which is staffing and human resourcing. So bigger than that, and I know there's been lots of conversation at the table, having had the opportunity to be here at panel a lot, what do we do with all this action that we're taking or not taking? And so from an information dissemination perspective, when we receive the recommendations, we have an intentional focus on how are we engaging and using this information to support our practice enhancements. And this really helps us identify current actions, strategies, initiatives that are underway that would benefit or be enhanced by the intent of the recommendation. There are certainly recommendations we receive that don't align with current strategies, and that gives us moments to pause around, are we doing the right thing? Or is this a specific instance that's case related that requires some level of change or revision in policy? So when you look at this, we receive the recommendation, we develop our action plans with internal and external subject matter experts. This is all in collaboration with the recommending body. And then we have a multitude of outcomes. They can be policy development, they can be legislative changes that are being requested, relationship development and partnership across ministries and agencies, practice strategy development that Kim and John spoke about on Monday, or programmatic handbooks for caregivers and other supports. We implement those through some common strategies of intentional training, community of practice sessions, which Kim also talked about on Monday, where we're meeting with thought leaders in the field, internal communication, so emails, newsletters, updates, the policy to practice session, which is the monthly video session we host with our staff, and standards and monitoring and practice file reviews to see if the fidelity of those changes have occurred in the field. So when we look at our systemic recommendations, most of the recommendations we receive, again, are policy practice development. They're typically connected to several areas that we're already working on, and they require sequencing and integration with existing initiatives. The progress on these recommendations takes more time and is measured through progress on a larger shift as opposed to the potential ease of developing a simple policy or making a change or shift in a note on a policy. Not that policy is easy, but it's a little bit different than moving an entire system through a practice shift. This is something that all of you will be familiar with, but implementing a recommendation doesn't stop the process. So when you're researching and developing, you're looking at best practices, cross-jurisdictional scans, you're developing training, you're revising practice, you're doing pilot sites, you're integrating that information. Then you're training hundreds of staff, if not thousands. You're implementing and integrating across the entire the province, and you're looking at different implementation based on the unique needs and compositions of each community. And then you need to consistently review and evaluate through practice file reviews, continuous improvement activities, and most importantly, staff and stakeholder feedback. So this continuous loop means that every recommendation is really an infinite opportunity for continuous improvement. So if I take you back to numbers, because I know how much everybody likes numbers, 28 of the active recommendations that we talked about, or nearly 50%, are tied to one or more of the 3 system-wide initiatives. So the Child Intervention Practice Framework, Foundations of Caregiver Support, or the Child Intervention Learning and Development project we have underway. And all 3 of those were talked about Monday with Kim and John. Those recommendations are really focused on key areas of improvement such as staff competencies, evidence-informed practice and policy development, technological support enhancements, supporting child development and understanding brain architecture and impacts of trauma. And we've identified through our recommending bodies that these are connected to our initiatives. Some of these 28 recommendations, just to be a little bit more complex, link to more than one initiative, and some of them link to initiatives that aren't included in the 3. So if we look specifically at the Child Intervention Practice Framework, there are 20 of the 28 recommendations linked to this. So this is based on outlining of our core principles, supporting staff in making decisions and supporting their working with families, development and revision of specific practice strategies, so signs of safety, lifelong connections, or collaborative service delivery, front-end strategies that you heard about on Monday, supporting staff in the changes through policy to practice, ongoing training and community practice opportunities. The Child Intervention Learning and Development Project accounts for 8 of those active recommendations. This is a deliberate method of trying to train and support our staff. As discussed on Monday, it's about staff readiness and in an adult learning environment that recognizes the need to build staff capacity over time through a series of intentional classroom and on-the-job learning and mentoring opportunities. This is the redevelopment of staff competencies for various roles in service delivery to better reflect our skills and abilities and attitudes to deliver child intervention services efficiently and effectively with respect. And if we look at foundations to caregiver support, there are 10 active recommendations. So if you're doing the math, you're like, wait a minute, that's 38. That's because some of these recommendations are tied to more than one. So we're still talking about the original core 28 recommendations. So Foundations to Caregiver Support supports research in the area of child development and the effects of trauma on child development, grief and loss, and how that translates into working with caregivers to be trained and supported, to look at extended families in different ways, to be more intentional about understanding, as John phrased it, what's happening for you, not what happened to you. These recommendations are all coming from investigative reviews, so they are connected to Remembering Brian, 7-year-old Jack, 16-year-old Sam, which was a serious injury, 8-year-old Benita, serious injury, 8-year-old Ella, 2-year-old Tiana, serious injury, and 17-year-old Michaela. So in your package, because it's really hard to see on the screen, you received the Foundations of Caregiver Support Project Registry. This is an internal document we use to manage our progress on some of our larger initiatives. And if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see 3 little R's. These are the primary areas for this strategy where these 8 recommendations or 10 recommendations are housed. So they're focused on the RFP process for residential care. They're focused on policy alignment project that Kim and John referenced, and they're also focused on training and capacity. So the Foundation Caregiver Support 101s, which you'll receive more information about in the coming days, and you did hear a little bit about on Monday. I didn't keep up in my turning. Go. So another way to look at it is if we take a look at one recommendation, and I think a larger one of this was also provided. If we look at one recommendation from 7-year-old Jack, this recommendation called for the preservation and resolution of relationships when planning for permanency, focusing on and involving children, addressing grief and loss, and deliberately planning for transitions in and out of care in a way that a child understands and minimizes abrupt loss in relationships. This is a massive recommendation when you really start to break down the elements. And so you can see here that while we received the recommendation in 13-14, we expect full and complete implementation to happen in 18-19. There are multiple pieces happening along the way, different strategies linked to this recommendation, including the practice framework, this family findings training that Kim talked about on Monday, the lifelong connections practice strategy to support children in maintaining connections to their community, culture, families. This is about foundations and caregiver support to support children in transitioning in and out of placements, whether that's removal from home or going home, or transitions between placements. This is about understanding the impact of trauma, grief, and loss. And it's also about training our staff and our caregivers in different new ways so that they have a better understanding. And all while we are aligning our policy to meet our principal practice. It was a lot, so I'm going to leave you to think about that for a little bit. I think we're going to do questions together at the end. Is that correct, Dr. Cho? Yeah.
Okay. Is the other presentation there? I see it. Should be the...
No.
All right. Let me introduce, please, Sherry May, who is sitting in, I'm not sure which MLA's seat. Apparently today she's Dr. David Swan. I must say, David, you're looking better. Sherry walked the stage last week for her social work education and is moving on to become a geologist where she wants to combine both social work and geology. So
rocks need help.
She's going to give rocks therapy, yeah. Sometimes they may be more responsive. We took a slightly different approach to this data. Sherry's going to describe in just a second how we went to it. We looked rather from a practice perspective as opposed to a policy perspective. So we did take a slightly different perspective on the data. We're going to walk you through Alberta. We're going to walk you through the Aboriginal Alberta. Then we're going to look at Canada, and then we're going to look at international, and then see where that takes us in terms of understanding overall thematic issues. So Sherry, do you want to describe how we did this stuff?
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So the methodology we used was looking at documents found in the Ministerial panel's documents, the huge thing you can find on the website. We also looked at reports released by OCYA and fatality inquiries, and we gathered the recommendations we found there, brought them together to find common themes. While there were multiple themes, there were 10 that rose most common, and others only rose once in a while. The 10 that rose most common included a lack of information sharing between multiple agencies involved with a child, a discrepancy with cultural and Aboriginal involvement with support for foster care, how child death review was communicated to the public, protocols surrounding suicide, and protocols surrounding training for individuals working with a child, a lack of interagency collaboration, a lack of sustaining family and kinship relations, a lack of meeting unique needs of children involved in care, a lack of increased supports for children and individuals that are involved in care, whether that be the child themselves, the worker, the family, kinship, or any foster care placement or external placement.
So just before you move on, you'll see on the left-hand side, really the implications of this fall, if you think about this in a thematic way, the implications are either going to be changes of practice approaches, revised legislation, or funding and caseload and priority setting over a long term. And you'll recognize that language is different. And that's one of our first lessons, really, is that the language of stepping back and analyzing is often different than practice language or administrative language, such as we've just heard.
Next, we looked at issues and recommendations specifically relating to the Aboriginal communities. We found that 5 major areas were funding, legislation, practice, accountability, and a child-centered approach that were mentioned. We later divided those into sections that were very specific, which included a lack of community and language and culture involvement, a lack of keeping connections for family and kinship, significant people, elders, a lack of communication between the worker and the child, and a lack of support systems in place for everyone involved.
So what we did with that is we looked at it as what were the factors that were deemed to be intersecting with the child. And again, you'll see on the left-hand side implications, and essentially they come down to the same collection. But the one difference here is there was much more emphasis in these areas on targeting the root issues of Aboriginal involvement in the child intervention system. So here we move on to look at an overview of the Canadian data. And in this particular one, we took 70 some odd reports from across Canada over time. I think one of the most interesting things for this process is the political response, which is different from the administrative response, which is different from the practice response. There is some very interesting research that says that the problem with the political response, and this is a difficult conversation in this particular table with politicians sitting around us, but one of the things they said about the political response that really has come out of the research quite strongly is that the political response does two things. One is it is very focused on an N of 1, being the particular case at the particular moment, as opposed to the systemic view of what that case represents. And in addition, and this was really quite fascinating, this came from very detailed research that was done across hundreds of serious case reviews in the United Kingdom, was that the politicians not only did the N of 1, but they did a second N of 1, which was their own children. And they brought the emotion of their own children into the analysis of the emotion associated with the particular case. Why that was deemed to be problematic is because the comparison typically between the average politician's children and the socio-demographic position of that child is so dramatically different from the population typically in a child intervention system that the comparisons are poor. But they became the base of comparison for many politicians, and they started to drive the policy discussion from that perspective, which was actually counterproductive for the needs of the particular population being served by a child intervention system. It's a difficult conversation, but it became one of the really important things. And I'm not going to go through this long list of recommendations, but the major theme that comes out is really that it's not clear that reviews are leading to better practice at the front line, nor with allied professions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So, Maestro, if I could, or is it Vanna?
Not Vanna.
Okay. And again, I'm not going to go through this with you in detail. I'd like to really say to you that if you look at this series of recommendations and themes, what you begin to see is there are systemic issues, there are common errors. The common errors are very interesting. One of them is start-over syndrome. And John talked a little bit about that in his presentation the other day, where it's let's not worry about the history, we'll take you from where you are now, and we'll start from now. And you'll see that these are really practice decisions that a particular worker is going to make at a particular time. And what's different about what is here versus what John talked about the other day is that most of these decisions were made unilaterally by a worker without significant supervisory support or without significant peer support. And so the start-over syndrome was an example of, I don't know the history of this person, so I'm going to meet them where they're at. The other one is the failure to know the history, and that becomes an interesting systemic one, which several jurisdictions have done a lot of work on in terms of information systems. But what's interesting about that particular one is it got a lot of traction with the Jeffrey Baldwin case out of Ontario, where if they had read the record, they would have found that the grandmother had been convicted of child abuse, as had the step-grandfather. But nonetheless, the children were placed in that home. If you look at that systemically, what you look at is not the N of 1, but you look at the capacity for individuals to take information in and have information available. So again, John talked about some of the information process issues. Now, if we could go to the next slide. This is where it becomes fascinating stuff, okay? Now, you know, I'm an academic and a geek, so when I say fascinating stuff, you might be going, oh, God, he's going to go on about dry, dull statistics sort of thing. This may be actually the single most important piece of this research, is this slide. There is a dramatic amount of push for big data and predictive analytics in the field of child welfare. Now, big data and predictive analytics, let me tell you how it works in a way that should cause all of you to get scared. If you go to Los Angeles and you're a police officer in Los Angeles and you start your shift in Los Angeles, you will be told that you should probably direct your police car to a particular area of your patrol, because that's based on big data and predictive analytics that says crime is more likely to occur here than here. But when you take that apart, crime is more likely to occur here because the surveillance in this neighborhood is greater than in this neighborhood, and this neighborhood happens to be black, and this neighborhood happens to be middle-class white. That's the problem with predictive analytics, is what you put in. Now, this gets really crucial when we think about it in terms of First Nations people. Because when you think about the adverse childhood experiences study, for example, that we had referred to us, if you did adverse childhood experiences as an example, as one of your inputs of big data, you will automatically have every family on every reserve in this province come into the system, because it will be identified as having scores of 5 or more. That's a systemic big data problem. So what Geller found in his research is that you can get more true positives with big data. And a true positive means you have correctly identified an individual or a family who presents a risk to their child. But you do this at the rate of significantly elevated false positives. In other words, you bring into the system, in order to get the true positive, you bring into the system families that should never be in the system. And the adverse childhood experience is just a small example of how that can happen. So one of our difficulties is that we've got this push for big data going on, and there's 3 major projects going on in the United States on big data. But they have not solved this false positive, true positive problem. And in a province like Alberta, with a significant involvement of First Nations children in the child intervention system, that is an ethical landmine that invites us into another 60 scoop, because it will be inclusive of far significantly higher numbers of First Nations families. So when John talked about kinship care, the 85-15 formula, that's why that formula is so vital to us, because child death reviews and system interventions reviews are built on the 15%. That's very important to remember. So Serenity is one of the 15%. So the vast majority of reviews are built on the 15%. And if we use big data as our mechanism to build intervention systems, we will build it on the 15%. And we will therefore create a system that will potentially reduce death at the expense of a dramatic increase in involvement of families in the child intervention system that should not be involved in the system. That's really one of the major lessons. The other major lesson, if we could then move on to the next slide, is when we look at Alberta, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, what we see is there's a universality of the practice errors. We're not unique. So when we say somebody didn't share information between an agency, you see that in every jurisdiction without fail. When you see in a review that a child wasn't seen, you see that in every jurisdiction without fail. So there is a persistence of practice errors over time, and particularly when the practice is being done individually by a worker as opposed to by a team that includes a contrarian. And the contrarian is the person in the team who says, I don't buy it, convince me. The police are using that very effectively in homicide investigations in several jurisdictions, because what that does is it helps to correct one of the things that comes out in these reviews, which is decision-making bias. And decision-making bias comes in a couple of ways. One of the most interesting is confirmation bias. Now, if you're really interested in confirmation bias, you have to be an old guy like me, because the guys who developed confirmation bias were publishing when I was doing my BA. So that's sort of like just before the invention of dirt. But what it's been found is it continues to be some of the most significant decision-making information. And what they've learned is that when we begin to formulate a view on a case, we begin to filter the information to confirm the approach that we have already decided is what this case is about. Which, when I think about Sherry and I, one of the things that we did is we had to have debates about what we thought the data was telling us. She usually told me I was wrong, and she was usually right. So that's confirmation bias. The second one, which really affects reviews, is hindsight bias. The beginning of every review is different than it is for the social worker. Because the beginning of every review, we know how the story ends. The social worker doesn't. And that means that we can approach review with a hindsight bias, because we can look and say, you know, if you'd known that, you should have done that. But the point, of course, is the social worker didn't know that. So our systemic question is, was that information that could have been available, should have been available, or was that information that was withheld? And it's really important to think about that when we go back to the meeting we had at Bantaro, where there was conversation about what do families disclose or not disclose. That's an important part of this dynamic. So, managerialism, or the creation of checklists, forms, and other paperwork in many jurisdictions has been the response to these kinds of death reviews. So you didn't know this, so we're going to create a checklist to make sure you check this. Has not resulted in a decrease in deaths in any jurisdiction. I really want you to get that. Has not resulted in the death rate in any jurisdiction. So managerialism doesn't work. In addition, we know that when at a political or a media level, a case becomes a highlight case and dramatically places the worker or the system in focus, apprehensions go up. Children come into care more often. In the United Kingdom, following a very significant case called the Peter Connolly case, or the Baby Peter case, and if you Google it, you will literally find about 6,000 stories on that case. The apprehension rate in the United Kingdom went up and has not gone down since 2008 when that case occurred. That's an important policy issue. And because the Baby Peter case was done from a guilt, blame, shame perspective, and as a result, the social workers involved in child protection in the United Kingdom said, I will never be Sharon Shoesmith, who was on the front page of the Mirror for weeks and ended up getting sacked. So Sharon Shoesmith was the manager, the team leader of that case. And our research tells us that that is occurring that occurs in other jurisdictions. So, if we can hit the next one, what the data does tell us, though, is that there is a reduction in problems, not necessarily a reduction in deaths, but there is a reduction in poor outcomes when these factors come together, which is the relationship, as we heard being talked about the other night, resiliency building in both the family and the child, capacity building, in other words, coping capacity, skill capacity, that is specifically focused on the needs of the family, and risk management. Now, John didn't talk about risk management, I don't think, did he, Kim? Okay. So by risk management, I'm really now going to take you into politically uncomfortable territory. If you're going to be successful keeping more children at home, you're going to have to let the child welfare system have a tolerance to risk. Child death review, the 15%, diminishes the will of the politicians and government to tolerate risk. But as we've seen, if you diminish that, you will bring more children into care and you will have poor outcomes for children and families. But it means that when signs of safety doesn't work and there'll be a death that will be attributed to the administration of signs of safety, you're going to have to ask the question that panels don't like to ask but need to be asked, and that is, does that death negate signs of safety? If you operate from an N of 1, then you would say yes. Our job in the panel is not the N of 1. Our job in the panel is the N of 10,000. But there's an important pragmatic decision for the panel around where should government accept risk tolerance? That's a difficult question. It's important when we go back to the presentations we've had from the First Nations, because really when they talked about the deaths and the rates of deaths and their involvement in the child protection system, they really were talking about what is the degree of risk tolerance that you will try with us as First Nations people to get it right with our people. That's the underlying policy question. So, if we can then go to the next one, please. And the other piece, and this goes back to the what is the comparison group? The comparison group needs to be important, because the comparison group is who does child welfare work and what are the work with and what are the realities of this. So one of the lessons that comes out of the death review process is really quite a crucial one, and that is that acceptable parenting is a social construct. And so when we think about risk management, we're really saying what is the social construct of parenting with a population that is marginalized, hiding in fear, suffering from trauma, fear of their loss of their children, and unresolved grief that may be linked to addictions. It is not a comparison group of me, a middle-aged, ancient professor with gray hair, a beard, and white skin. That's not the reference group. It's very important that we contemplate the social construct of the reference group, so when we talk about success of the child welfare system, it is success within that reference group. So, if we can go to the next slide, and I'm almost done here. So we talked about there needs to be better research on successful cases. So we have the N of 1 where we do a lot of research on the negative cases, but we haven't been doing much research on the successful cases in the same way that we've done the research on the negative cases. So I think that's important for us to contemplate. I think that research is out there in various ways, but I think an intentional bit of research where we specifically do the kind of analysis that we've done with death review cases or serious injury cases that we do with cases where they're successful, so that we have a comparative database of what does successful look like within the social construct of working with the reference population. And finally, death review, if sole oversight mechanism, is a symptom management system as opposed to a solution management system. So if we're going to manage symptoms, then that's what leads us to managerialism. And the research from so my research, the work that Sherry's done, as well as the projects that have been done in multiple jurisdictions have said, if you manage symptoms, you will not get system improvement. You have to think about the solution, that is going to, in our case, hit the N of 10,000, not the N of 1. So that's really what all of this data has been telling us about the death review process and the potential policy responses or policy implications of what it is that we're looking at for this particular process. And I think I went fast, but I'm conscious that we have time limits. So I think that we're on to questions, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Try not to throw too many tomatoes at me.
All right. Any questions?
Yeah.
Wow.
No, no.
Whoa.
There are questions. There are questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Good information, really good work. Appreciate all the data. And I'm also kind of a nerd as well. I enjoy data. That's probably one of the things I enjoy most, and especially from a public health perspective. I do a lot of work around that, and we've done a lot of work at Siksika in terms of data development and analysis. Just a question, maybe a couple of questions. One for Sarita, is it?
Yes.
Again, I think the presentation is excellent. Just the questions, the answers are probably there. Just curious about a couple things. A lot of good recommendations. Just curious as to, again, how you sort of engaged Indigenous groups and organizations, their input into this process, and were they endorsed by, Indigenous organizations or groups? So those are my three, I guess, initial questions. Curious about that. And then the issue of, more to Peter, issue of data and life expectancy. Probably Peter knows this in Alberta, but it's really just a comment. We look at life expectancy, and you look at the life expectancy of First Nations versus non-First Nations Alberta. I'm pretty sure you know the difference. It's significant. The data tells us there's a 12-year difference in life expectancy between First Nations and non-First Nations in Alberta. And again, completely unacceptable. And I'm hoping that the work we do in the panel, is a process to begin to address those issues. I don't think there's any overnight solutions. I look at a lot of the challenges we face within First Nations. And, there was a comment about, or a point about people living in fear. I don't necessarily agree with that point. I talked to a lot of First Nation organizations and leaders, and they have a lot of great ideas and solutions. And as we heard from our elder today, a lot of strength and power in just in that encouragement there of the prayer and his wisdom there. So I strongly believe, in some of the examples that are out there in those communities. Had a chance to go to Ben Arrow and speak to some of the staff and incredible work they're doing over there, and I admire them for the work. So just some comments and just some questions in general. Thank you.
You want to go first?
Sure. So as I listen to your question, I'm thinking there might be two sides to that. So when we're receiving and evaluating recommendations, we are consulting with our internal groups, so Indigenous Community and Cultural and Community Connections, as well as our Field Operation Liaison Branch, who work with the delegated First Nation agencies, as we're starting to look at what is the intended outcome, how are we going to implement this rec, what actions do we have underway or initiatives linked to that. So we have that part. As far as our large 3 initiatives that I talked about and multiple others that weren't mentioned, we do work with our delegated First Nation partners on all of the development, implementation, training development, reviewing policies and practices with us, helping us develop those practice strategies, so they are engaged in that way. Does that answer what, or is there a different portion you were looking at?
It sort of does. I think, again, I think we know the numbers are overwhelming, the stats are there, the facts are there, so to me, we've done a lot of work since, going back decades, and so what has been the result of that work, and, how have we engaged the people that are impacted the most here, the most vulnerable, which are our children, and so to me, it's important, I'd like to know how we engage these individuals, how, have we heard from chiefs, have we heard from leadership, have we heard from elders out there, have we heard from families, and youth themselves. I think I give examples of the work we're doing in the South, especially around the area of suicides. We have a number of different initiatives we're working with the University of Calgary, Dr. Lindsay Croshoe in the area of drama and performing arts with suicides. And we also have an interesting relationship with Nike in terms of sports and grants and empowering our youth, and I think giving the message of hope and opportunity for our youth. So I think we've had to be very creative and innovative, and had to rely on our own resources. And really the ideas, and it's been driven by the youth themselves. So we've just sort of played a supporting role to that end. So
yes, if I back up a little bit from the initiatives, how those are being developed and implemented is really through engagement with not only our service delivery partners, but experiential families, youth, working with leadership. We have an elder wisdom circle at the ministry that we're consulting with. We are working with our delegated First Nations and other partners, as well as leadership. We have regular meetings with leadership with the ministry as well. We're engaging them through the trilateral working groups. We have a number of initiatives that feed everything back into these initiatives so that we're moving it in step together as opposed to running off in a direction and waiting for people to catch up.
So if I could just quick comment, Tyler, because it's a very good question. The themes that Sherry identified in terms of the Aboriginal issues arising from the reports and your comment are an important stark contrast, and they identify one of the weaknesses of a death review process. So those themes come out of the death review processes and the systemic processes. And what you're describing instead is that if we start to do a review of practice strengths, of communal strengths, of systemic strengths, we would begin to see a different process. So in research projects I did with a group of elders, I remember Elder Leonard Bastine, who's opened one of the meetings here, saying, in his case in the Piikani Nation, that we have doctors, we have accountants, we have lawyers, we have social workers, we have strength. And that story doesn't get told. But he also goes on to say, but it's done from a perspective of the cultural understandings, the wisdom of the nation and the wisdom of the elders, that those of us who are not part of that struggle to understand and struggle to see the strength of. So I think your point's a really crucial one, because that helps to show the narrow purview of the death and serious case review process.
Patty.
Thank you. My question is for Sarita. So in your presentation, you said something that I thought was kind of provocative, that recommendations that have been received that do not align with current direction gives you pause, or the department pause, and start, a question about, are we going in the right direction? So can you give us an example of that? The direction you were going in, the recommendation that's going in another direction, and how that is reconciled? And that's it. I mean, we could have somebody else do a question and then come back if you need to think about it, because,
I think some of the ones, ironically, are what seem to be the simple ones. They're requests to revise policy X, but in a very directive, specific way. And it makes us kind of stop, because you have to remember who's the audience we're intending to write the policy for. If internally who we write the policy for is our staff, correctly interpret policy, but recommending body Y feels that if you rewrote it this way and stated this and added this red yellow note in the middle of the page, it would be interpreted in a way better fashion, leading to a better outcome. And it causes a tension, because we're not writing the policy for an external pundit. We're writing it internally for our staff. And through our own practice reviews, our own evaluation, our understanding from our staff, they interpret it correctly. It makes you step back and go, well, we have a massive policy alignment project on way. Do you add this into the queue to, as Peter would say, checkbox off that you wrote the policy? How do you reconcile that sometimes? So that could be one of the examples. There are other ones around legislative changes that have been requested. That the ADM should function as the statutory director, and the statutory director should take on a different role and responsibility. We've had those in the past, and you kind of step back and you think, well, we've always fundamentally had a statutory director under the legislation who has this level of authority, and the ADM has operational requirements. Where did this recommendation percolate through? And then you have to step back and think, but what does that mean organizationally if you realign your legislation to an ADM instead of a stat director? So those are the types of recommendations that make us stop for a minute and think, based on this review that occurred, what led them to that? And in the past, when we didn't have the ability to go back and communicate with our recommending bodies to say, walk us through how you reviewed this information and got to this recommendation, we've had to do some guessing.
Okay. That highlights a few tensions around engaging panels, reviewers, to do work and spend time doing work, and having recommendations come forward with whether they should be implemented. There's this tension that arises in what you're saying, that there has to be a way forward that we reconcile this, because forever the department will be seen as being resistant if we don't somehow have recommendations that are implementable. At the same time, we have to parse it out to say, is this just resistance, or is there reason for that? And I think that this tension leads us to, unanswered recommendations or difficult to implement recommendations. This has to be resolved.
Yeah. More difficult to implement. If you look back even at the numbers, there's only 13 in 10 years that weren't accepted. And I mean, I said ironically, kind of flippantly before, but a lot of those at the time were not accepted and have subsequently been implemented through other things that happened over time.
Right.
So there are a very minute handful. And those, if you go through the very large document, the reason we didn't accept them is because we had other existent mechanisms that were doing the exact same thing in place.
Right. So yeah, and that was not a comment about you are resistant as a department. I'm saying it's about perceptions, and we are dealing often, from Dr. Choate's presentation, that perception drives recommendation, drives policy, drives legislation. I've never seen one good piece of policy come out of emotion or opinion. Never. But I think that this is where the tension exists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Could I just add a piece to that in terms of our ability to have dialogue about, like, what are the findings of a review? That's really relevant, and then to have consideration for then what could we do about that? So the discussion about what would be implementable or what would work. And the balance always is, and I think MLA Sweet and Goring can attest to this as well, is we can't be releasing new policy tweaks every month. And so we have to sit back and pace and sequence things out. And so we can't run ahead of other work that we know is planned, underway, anticipated by staff. And so we appreciate when we have the opportunity to say, well, there's your findings, and we can say, either that's new information for us, thank you for that, or yes, we agree. Either way, here's the path we're on, and where could we insert some opportunities to influence that. That, I think, is a helpful intersection. That would be helpful to the department, so that it's always about, yes, how can we get better, and not the debate about an implementable recommendation or not.
Heather.
Thank you for the presentation. So I want to go back to the conversation around looking at reviews in a strengths-based perspective. So how do we do a strengths-based analysis on files to look at our successes and highlight the good work and base practice experience on those files instead of this reactive 1%, 15% children that pass away. And so it makes me wonder how we can do that. One, I guess my question would be is how do you measure what success would look like then? And then when we're looking at the confirmation bias, so I worked primarily, and I've always been open about this, in a harm reduction model with youth, where to me success was we made it another day, or they went to school once this week, or they're not staying at that person's house. We found them at somebody else's, but I like that house better than I like this house. And it's very risk. It's risk practice. Like everything we did had a significant risk to it. So when we talk about risk aversion and we talk about, that mentality, I guess my question is there were great successes that came out of that work. And I mean, like with the high-risk youth unit and with the workers that were doing that work, many youths probably are still living in our, being functional adults because of that program. But there was lots of resistance because it was extremely engaged in a harm reduction piece, but yet great success. So how do you measure the success when you're also looking at the fact that it was abiding by the legislation, but doing it within a policy of its own that probably didn't really exist?
Well, I think this is a fascinating question. Tyler and I can, and I think probably Bruce as well, can have a geeky conversation for some time about this one. You're really identifying one of the most complicated aspects that I think reviews don't come to grips with, is success is a relative term. So you have described that success in your particular caseload was harm reduction driven. And that made a lot of sense in that particular caseload. And in a caseload which is heavy maybe on individuals with FASD, success is going to look quite different. If we go to Tyler's reserve at Sixica, success is going to look different than if we go over to Tsutina. And so success is a relative contextual term. Now, John described on Monday parameters of things that they contemplated as successful outcomes in a general way. And so one of the questions is, how far will we drill down in that data, and how will we segregate populations in terms of success? But I think that your point is something that death review panels don't get to, which is the contextual nature of success, moderate failure, or significant failure in a case, because they don't contemplate necessarily the context of that particular case in a very systemic way. Now, I happen to think that the Alberta advocate does a better job than most trying to look at that piece, but there is no question that if you're going to contemplate research that looks at what is success, you're going to have to do it in a segregated population way because of those various social constructs. And Bruce may, who's a far better researcher than I in this kind of area from his CIS work, may have some thoughts about that.
I will, but I'll jump in after.
Okay, well, I'm done.
Well, I think one thing to think about when you're measuring success is measuring success on a case level, which is really, really critical, because I think workers should be asking those questions. Did I make it through another day? Did this child get better? Was this child, surviving even though all the odds are stacked against them? This is so critical. Are families staying together? Are they beating the odds? And this is important stuff to look at on a one-by-one basis. I think equally important for systems of care and organizations like Child and Family Services would be to look at it at a more global, higher level, to look at the aggregate data and say, how do we understand this now? So when I think about outcomes, I think about 4 areas, 4 domains. One would be permanence. If we can achieve permanence for kids at high risk, that's a good thing 99.9% of the time. We need to work on child well-being and look at success for kids individually, but at that aggregate level. And there's lots of ways to measure it, but that's the larger domain. A third one would be keeping families and children within the family and the community. Just essential. Lots of ways to measure that. And the final one, and the one we're kind of focusing on right now, is child safety, which is a critical one, but big picture, boy, I'd be focusing on the others equally or more, to be honest. But for any one of these domains, if you look at permanency, for example, we know the kids that get changed from one foster home to another foster home and another foster home, that's a recipe for disaster. It's not a good thing for anybody. But on a case level, a child moving from one situation to another might be the best decision, even though it's getting counted as a debit, right? Because they're one more move. But safety level, it's increasing the odds for success for that one individual case. When you look at it at a higher level, however, the aggregate data would say less moves would be better. That's what we're shooting for. That's what we're trying to get to. So I always look at the difference between case level success and then more of a systems level success, because that's going to be pointing some of the fingers about what we should be paying attention to and how do we get to more of the things we want to achieve, right? A child might be living in this is long, one more comment. A child might be living in a foster home that is fairly stable, and you might be hesitant to move, but at the same time, that child might have just, had severed all connections to their community, to their culture, to their extended family, to their indigenous beliefs and thoughts. And so you've got to balance success in a way of is one more placement move better or worse than the fact that we've severed this young person's connection to a much bigger thing in their world. And if that's the case, it's a no-brainer in that way. Forget the placement, take one more, go for the greater good in another area. But it's when you look at the 4 areas, 4 larger domains, these are balancing things that you've got to juggle and say, on a case level, you're making those very hard decisions. On an aggregate level, as a province, you're saying, what direction do we want to go in more? Do we want to support more of this? Of course we do. But it's going to come at a cost in the other domains.
Okay, I've got, just a reminder, we've got about 10 more minutes here for questions, and I'm going to just hop over to the phones because we have a couple questions there, and I think they're a little bit disadvantaged not being here in person today. Greg?
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm just going to proceed as if you can. If you can't, I guess, well, we'll just keep going. I want to pick up on what Patty said, and I wrote it down quickly and I'll have to paraphrase because I don't think I caught all of it. The emotion doesn't drive good decisions. And I think that, speaking plainly, and Peter, you were bang on, nothing to apologize for. That's something for all of us who are politicians here to think about, frankly, especially those of us in opposition. The politics are easy in these very high-profile cases. That doesn't mean that we don't need to look at the systemic issues that led to cases like what happened to Serenity. And I want to come back to that. I don't want to lose sight of that. I want to come back to that. But I agree with you that in many cases and often many aspects of what is a very complex and challenging situation, a lot of political noise is not helpful. And so that's something I would suggest to my colleagues on the opposition side that we bear in mind. And that all of us in the panel remember as we move eventually through the process and into our deliberations. And what my questions focus around are, how do we ensure that there is a level of accountability or a level of, I guess, how do we move from creating a fear reaction within the department when something goes wrong and there's news about it, which I can only imagine, having worked in some large organizations, and something goes wrong, you retrench and you go, ugh, I don't like how that is portrayed. We better put up the barricades and not tell anyone anything, and perhaps find a scapegoat. How do we accept the contextual definition of success that has been discussed here today, that success in one case is not the same as success in another, success in one jurisdiction is maybe not the same as success in another. How do we address these big, challenging issues while ensuring the public sees that the system is continually improving? The public believes that the system is doing what it can and should in even highly complex cases. I'll open that up to anyone who wants to answer. Peter, Sarita, anyone. I hope you understand where I'm coming from with that question. I hope I've been clear enough.
Okay, so I'll dive in first, and others. I want to refer immediately back to Bruce's comments about the 4 large-scale outcomes, because I think that that's important. You're never going to get away from the difficulty of the public when a child dies, because from the public's perception, there is something different about a child dying than a plane going down or a child died in hospital from cancer or a medical disease. There's something different in the public's mind about this population. So the tolerance that the public has for a death or a misadventure is much lower in this population than it is with most other population groups. So if we continuously frame the conversation by utilizing these outcome measures that Bruce is talking about, then we start to have conversations that are about how outcome is getting addressed. The death review process is important because the death review process is part of that assurance mechanism by which the public can say, okay, there is somebody who's watching. The other piece that I think, Greg, really comes to your question is we shackle child welfare, the child intervention system, from telling their story in difficult cases. And there may be very good privacy reasons for that and that sort of stuff. But it is also important that we do. We shackle them. And so thus we don't allow them to do what you as a politician try to do every time, which is to get in front of the story. They are always going to be behind the story because of the privacy concerns. And so that means they're always in a position where they can't tell to the public at the time that it's a major story. They can't tell what it is that actually happened to the child. That's why the death review process is so vital. But we do need to find some ways by which the child intervention system, as part of its transparency, can also talk about the things that it is doing well and to find ways to bring, as Bruce is describing, these large-scale success stories into the dialogue. And the framework, the outcome matrix framework that Bruce is talking about, I think becomes an important place to start that conversation, because you're able to put some data out there, you're able to put some real story to that data, and thus you're able to humanize that. But you can't do it with a death because the child intervention system is always behind that story. I don't know if that answers your question, but you're nodding, so yeah, okay.
All right, and I believe Rick also on the phone had a question.
Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Sure.
Yes.
Hello.
That's a thumbs up.
Trying real hard here.
We can hear you.
Whoever the camera's on, if they could.
He's on the phone. Rick,
Oh,
we can
sorry.
hear you, Rick. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Technology.
So go ahead. I've got a few questions. I'll try to get them rapid fire here so that I don't take up too much time. And I guess I was also interested in the comment about loud noise from the opposition not helping, but I guess I would submit as a counterpoint, if you don't mind, Peter, that we wouldn't have had this ministerial panel without the opposition noise. And I appreciate it. The noise doesn't help us make good decisions, but sometimes it helps move the government off from inaction to action. I was particularly interested, Peter, your comments about the 60 scoop, because I've been of the opinion since we've been early in this thing that the 60 scoop is still going on today in some lesser form. I'd be interested in your opinion on that. I also, you talked about managerialism doesn't work. Does that mean that we should be going more on principles than on 1,000 policies when we're teaching the workers in the system how to do their jobs? And the other thing that you talked about how because of the way that we look at big data that we end up, I think I heard you say, you didn't use these words, but you suggested that we get more kids, for example, out of First Nations and other Indigenous populations because of the big data guide points. So my question to you is, should we be sending 15 or 28% of the lowest kids that are in care now back to their parents tomorrow because perhaps they will do as well or better there than they will under government care? And that's it, if you could hear me.
Okay. So let me tackle each of those questions, Rick. I think they're very good questions. And Tyler, I'm gonna ask you to join me in this conversation. Is the 60 scoop still going on? Cindy Blackstock would certainly say yes. When you have the significant level of overrepresentation in the child welfare system of one particular racial group, you would have to say yes. And I think that from a data perspective, when we looked at the First Nations data, you certainly would see themes that would be consistent with the 60 scoop. But Tyler, I suspect you might have more that you'd like to say about this. So,
I probably can speak maybe all evening, but I think, I agree with your comments, and certainly in another organization I'm involved with, with our First Nations Health Consortium of Alberta, very familiar with that process, especially the issues around Jordan's principles. And again, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings, and the level of, defense the federal government has taken against those rulings. So I'm supportive of the comments you've made, and certainly I agree that it still exists today, and even a form of, the more modern day residential school system exists today.
Okay. Oh, Patty, you have...
Can I on a depart, because I think the question was a little bit about should we be sending more kids home?
Yeah, I think that's the third part, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll wait, because I think department should probably answer that
Yes.
one in terms of what we've done, but we'll wait.
I'll absolutely toss that one to you. In terms of the managerialism, the research says, Rick, that there is a balance. You have to have enough procedure to ensure that there is a degree of consistency and persistency to the process. But managerialism is when you over-process, you over-manage, you over-direct, and as a result, workers are not spending time sitting face-to-face with clients, they're sitting face-to-face with the computer and filling out forms that are not adding to the safety of the child or the outcome for the child. In the big data one, and I'm going to toss most of that over to Joni, but in the big data one, my concern is that the big data utilizes a series of factors that are associated with, for example, negative outcome for a child. So you would have, for example, alcoholism, poverty, distance from services, those sorts of things that would automatically bring a First Nation into the equation. And that's going to add another layer of a 60 scoop type of structure where First Nations would be extremely vulnerable to inclusion in the system based upon that kind of big data approach. these proponents of big data say, well, that's just a matter of tweaking the data. But to this point in child protection, there isn't a good example of that data having been tweaked in a way where a minority group is not overrepresented. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I haven't seen an example of it. But in terms of should more kids be going home, I'm not answering that. I'll let Joni swim in that pool.
Well, I'd be curious to know what you think, but what I want to remind, it's a great question, and I want to take you back to Monday's presentation where there was a bit of a caseload shift that was shown on those slides as a result of some of the improvements that are being attempted that really do focus on relational practice and honor the fact that kids need to stay home or go home. And so we didn't pick 10 or 15% to send home, but there's been a significant reduction in the in-care caseload to the extent that there's 1,000 less Indigenous kids in care than there was. So MLA McIver, you're onto something. It's not a matter of picking a certain percentage, but the drive is there to look at, can kids stay home or go home? Because we know that identity and culture, they're not recreation or they're not a benefit, they're a lifeline. And we should know that from our own families. So absolutely, that's where we want to go. Dr. Choate raises an interesting point that when one of those situations maybe has a terrible outcome, it can come at the expense of really good decisions for other kids. Dr. Choate referenced removal rates increasing after reviews, and you've seen that in other jurisdictions, and we saw that actually in one large region about 7 years ago, where there was a really public death, and the removal rate of little babes 0 to 3 from their families went up by 30% with not factoring risk. And that wasn't because workers were bad intended. It's because the messages get confusing and messy, and there's a lot of anxiety that comes as a consequence of those things.
I'd like to add, Rick, in respect of that, the research on long-term outcomes is complicated, and so if we take a group, and there's a group in Chicago that's been following a population for, it's over a decade, the Courtney group, it's about, is it 10 years, Bruce? Or about 10 years. And they took a higher risk group in the child welfare system and followed them over time. And they were the ones that had the instabilities and so on. And it's absolutely true that they had very poor outcomes, and those poor outcomes led to intergenerational involvement in the child intervention system. On another piece of research, though, an economic modeling piece of research that was done at MIT showed that if you take a moderate risk group or an average child welfare population, you'll have a part of that population that it's incredibly clear you should leave at home. And you will have a part of that population where it's incredibly clear that you should take them out. That being the 15% that John Reeves was talking about on Monday. But on an economic modeling basis, they said that group in the middle where child welfare workers themselves would probably have disagreements amongst themselves on what you should do, if you leave them in the home, they do better over time. And so that speaks to, I have my reservations about signs of safety and family finding, and so I'm not a disciple in the way that John was on Monday. But it does speak to those kinds of programs are probably going to be more beneficial to children than our removal programs when you think about the non-15% population. And so it's important to remember that the big data is focused actually on the 15% population.
We are already well into our supper time here, and I've got still a couple more people on the list.
Can I just clarify one thing about the 60 scoop?
Sure.
So just before we continue, the 60 scoop, it was a specific reference to the change from the federal government's policy of taking children and putting them in residential schools to change their colonization and assimilation focus to child welfare. In the 60s, the goal was to place Indian children in good white families who would be the mechanism of assimilation. The reason for apprehension has changed to risk, but the overrepresentation has stayed the same. And so the 60 scoop it continues only in the very, very subtle and underlying racism that occurs within the system. But the reason now is risk. It's not, the official policy is not assimilation. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, if, Maria, you had a question, I think Graham has given up his, but if you could make it really, really quick, and then we're going to have to take our supper break.
Okay, so I'm going to preface my question by saying my experience in another department is that there's way more successes than failures. And I suspect the same thing is true within the child welfare system. And but we're here because there was a failure. So as politicians, how do we better understand the successes that are coming out of the system and look at that in terms of the whole picture?
I would come back to two things. One is we need to provide you on an ongoing basis provision of data that outlines how the system is being successful so that the conversation is not only at the times that disaster is occurring. And then secondly, and that means we've got to do the kind of research and we've got to follow the kind of outcome matrix that Bruce is talking about. And then secondly, at least within the political system, I think that the child intervention system, and I'm speaking as a researcher here, not as a manager in CIS, but I think at least with the minister and with the politicians, child welfare should get out in front of the story so that you understand the case, and therefore, as an informed government or an informed opposition, you're able to have conversations that are based upon what appears to have happened in the case as opposed to speculation or media interest that because it's that if we give to the media a void, then the media will fill that void. That's their job. And so I'm not being critical of the media. But I think one of that is that we have to respect the politicians so that we can tell them the stories, both on an ongoing basis about the successes, but also help you to understand when something didn't go well. And also to have the death review process.
Yeah.
So that you're able to say to the media, there will be an accountability, and there will be a review. I want to talk about these other cases that were successful, but yes, we've been briefed on this, we understand, and we support this death review process. I'm not trying to be a politician here and tell you how to do it, but I think that often you're hampered by not having the information that allows you to have the conversation. And again, I'm a researcher. I'm not child intervention, so I'm not speaking for child intervention. They may have heard what I just said and went, well.
Can I just add in one thing? I can feel the tension from my coworkers in the back, and I hope I'm about to say this thing that they're thinking. But just to kind of close that loop around the big data tension and the successes at a case level, I just want to remind people we've had in multiple conversations, but maybe not succinctly, we do have our own outcome measures. And John rattled them off really fast on Monday, so you had to listen quickly. But, keep kids home, send them home quickly, get them permanent loving homes when they can't go home, transition them to healthy, successful adulthoods, all in a contextual and in a cultural context that's appropriate for them. So we have outcome measures that we're starting to work on from a larger big data perspective. Our 10,000 kids, how are they doing? But we also have a lot of work that we've undertaken, and this was covered a bit on Monday, to look at the successes at the case level so that we can expand and enhance on those across similar cases. So we have our community practice where our thought leaders are coming together and sharing innovative ways that they've delivered their practice. We have our practice review file audit going on right now where we're looking at the fidelity of our practice strategies, what's working best, what do we need to enhance, what do we need to review, and we do multiple feedback opportunities. We have against our strategies, we have pilot sites happening, we get feedback on our training from our internal and external caseworkers and agency staff. We're doing surveys with families, youth, experiential youth. There's a lot going on at a case level and a big data level, and I think what Kim and John were trying to say at the end of their presentation is if we had the time and the space, we could pull that together, and it would support the public in understanding how the system and what it's working towards, and it would support the political level and understanding there are a lot of successes. There are some great stories, but we're in an awkward tension spot where we don't quite have the time and space to do what we need to do to get it out there.
I'd like to throw an idea out, and I'm stealing from Bruce here, so I'm going to give him full credit for this idea. Because they use it with the CIS data, and that is the very brief one-page summarical document that can be consumed quickly, but equally that the people sitting around this table whose job it is to answer to their constituents gets these kinds of things that are quick updates about what the data looks like, so that they've got a capacity to talk, so that when they've got a constituent who comes to them, that they're in a position of having some data, and in a consumable way. I know you're about to break, so I could do one last thing. My presentation is due to a lot of hours of very hard work by Sherry. She didn't get all the recognition she deserves, because I keep talking and don't give her a chance, but she did a ton of hard work, and I just want to acknowledge it and thank her for it.
All right, we're going to need to take a break right now. We're already over time. So can we keep it to 20 minutes and be back at 10 to 6, no later? All right, we are going to get ready to call the committee back to order. And Greg, I don't know if you're aware, but you're the big screen sensation here. We get to see you, and you look fabulous. You're overlooking us like the eye in the sky.
Like Oz.
Like Oz, yeah.
Those are nice light pictures.
So yeah, just be aware that we can see you. Yeah. All righty.
If you pick your nose under it, it probably is. When they speak, we need to use.
That's pretty good.
We'll do the best we can.
All right, as long as you let me know. All right, we're going to move into our next presentation, where we have Child Intervention, Workforce, Workplace Culture, and Staff Morale, with presenters Catherine Fendall, Marshall Boyd, Kimberly Spicer, Daryl Danicos. Okay, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I feel like I'm still eating dinner. So today we're going to spend just about a half hour with you talking about our workforce within child intervention. My name is Catherine Fendall. I'm one of the directors within Human Resources, and one of my roles is to develop and maintain HR programs that support employee engagement in both children's services and community and social services. So more specifically today, we're going to talk to you about some workforce data. We're going to go through some learning and development, employee engagement, and the engagement survey, and to finish off with some financial information for you. So to start off with, our workforce, and I'm just waiting for the slides to go up. So just on the third slide, in terms of child intervention, we have about 1,350 caseworkers within child intervention and 350 supervisors. Now, these are the people that deliver the frontline child intervention services. Then we have about 160 employees in what we consider our corporate group, and that corporate group works on adoptions, post-adoptions, policy work, some quality assurance, and program evaluation and performance. Then we have about 275 employees or people that work with the DFNAs, the Designated First Nations Agencies. These are not employees of government. They're hired directly by the agencies. However, we do provide them with delegation training so we can continue that consistent program delivery. And then finally, there's about 4,000 full-time employees that work in the contracted agencies that we work with. In terms of hiring child intervention workers, they're hired into what we call our human service workers stream, which is our classification. I've shown you the three here because these are the three most predominant classifications that we hire child intervention workers into. You'll notice that first one, HSW 5, that entry level it's actually a bit of a misnomer. It's when we hire someone into an HSW5, we actually consider them at a professional working level. But keep in mind, just like with any role that we hire someone into, they're not going to be job ready. Some will be, but a lot of them aren't. So they require a lot of training and support, especially once that hiring process is completed. So in terms of what we look for in minimum recruitment standards, for an HSW5, we're looking for someone with a Bachelor of Social Work with some related experience. And by some, we're talking about 6 months for that. Now, there are also people who come to us with equivalencies. They might not have that Bachelor of Social Work. They might have a Master's in Social Work. And if they do, we don't require them to have any experience. If they come to us with a related degree, a Bachelor of, say, recreational therapy, something along those lines, we would require them to have 2 years of experience. And if they come to us with a diploma, then we would ask that they have 3 years of experience. When an employee then wants to move into that assessor or that generalist role, which is that HSW6 role, what we require there, or the minimum recruitment standard, is the Bachelor of Social Work with 1 year of related experience. And again, there's equivalencies in that stream. And then our next level, the HSW7, is that supervisor role. And that is a Bachelor of Social Work with 2 years related experience. And again, equivalencies we look at for that as well. So I'll just hand you over to Marshall, who will give you just a bit more detail on our workforce data.
Hi there. So just quickly, we have 2,000, this data here on this slide and the next is actually for the entire child intervention division. So it's not looking at only the human service worker classification. It's all the employees in the division, so senior executives, managers, policy folks, the whole deal. So altogether we have 2,700 active employees. So this doesn't count anybody who's on a short-term leave, maternity leave, or long-term disability, anything like that. It's just those employees that we expect to be coming to work on a daily basis. Of those 2,700, you'll have to forgive me. It says 84% and 14%, which the astute observer will see is only 98%, and it should be 86% female and 14% male. So a predominantly female workforce. And 3/4 of the workforce of that 2,700 are professional technical employees. So frontline delivery workers or the actual policy workers, people who are not managers and who aren't doing admin work. And only 6% of the division is actually made up of management. Our age distribution, I think it looks pretty nice. It's fairly even across all ages, with half of employees being between 35 and 54 years old, and about a third of employees younger than 40. So there are some older employees in there, which is good. They have probably more experience, but not so many that we're looking at a large number of retirements in the very near future. On the next slide, starting with the retirement risk. So this is just kind of looking at some issues that might be coming up in the future. So the retirement risk, we have 3 categories of low, medium, and high, based off of people's eligibility for an unreduced pension. So the 80-85 factor is a combination of age and your years of service with the government. And if it's an 80 or an 85, 80 for managers, 85 for non-managers, you're eligible for an unreduced pension. Lots of people start work with government fairly young, so they may reach that at a younger age. So if you only have the 80-85 factor, if you're only eligible for a pension, we consider that a lower risk of retirement. 62 is the average age of retirement in the public service. So if you are 62 or older, but you don't have your eligibility for an unreduced pension, we consider that sort of a medium risk. And if you have both, that you're over 62 and you're eligible for an unreduced pension, that's our high risk pool of employees. So overall, we have 11% of our workforce that is at some level of risk, and 3% that we consider a high risk. That's about 80 people. Keeping in mind that for the past 5 years, the average rate of retirement has only been about 2% of our workforce. So while 11% are at risk of retiring, typically only 2% of employees actually do retire in a given year. The next box below that, after 5 years, this is just keeping in mind that our workforce isn't static. We do change every year. So if nothing else changed about our workforce, 5 years from now, 1 in 10 employees would be at high risk for retirement, and 1 in 5 management employees would be at high risk of retirement, and then about a third of administrative employees would have some level of risk. The big pink box there, this is to show how much general illness is being used by employees. General illness is taking more than 3 consecutive days of illness, typically used for like a short-term illness, like you get the flu, so you're out for a week, or you have a minor surgery, but goes up to 80 days of possible general illness, so it can be a longer-term period. Most of our employees the majority of people making use of general illness leave are under 10 days of general illness in a given year. So the vast majority is a relatively short amount of time, though you can see that there are some employees that use a little bit more time off. And then the annual voluntary departure rate. In the last year, in 2016, it was just below 7% of our employees voluntarily departed. So this is when you choose to leave government, you're not transferring to another department, you're actually saying, I'm done working with government. You could be moving to another province, or you could have found other employment, and it's not counting retirements. So this is purely just when you say you're young and you're just done working here for now. The 6% is for the entire division as a whole. If we were to look at just human service workers, there's actually only 3% of our human service workers that choose to leave government in 2016. So about half the rate compared to the entire division. So there's more employees in administrative or management that are looking for other work elsewhere. So on the next slide, this is our sort of total movement of child intervention staff. So it does take into account transfers to other departments. Basically, so the blue line is anytime somebody was not working for us and did start working for us in this division as a human service worker. So whether they were in another department or had a different role and became an HSW, so they began working in the field. And then the red line is the movements out. So this is people who have either left or retired or transferred to a different department, or were promoted out of the HSW stream into a management stream. So what I think is really the key thing here is that while we do have a decent level of movement, we are able to find qualified, competent people to replace our HSW workforce. So there's enough people in Alberta that can do the work, that are qualified, that we're able to replace from that pool, we're able to replace our labor force. So we're not constantly short of employees.
Hello, I'm Kim Spicer. I work in the Policy Practice and Program Development Branch for Human Services, and I oversee the policy teams and the practice teams. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit around how we engage and onboard and train our staff, as my area is involved in developing the content for that, and in looking at how current practice, research, and evidence can inform those pieces of training. Before I launch into the slide, I just wanted to also add something on the last slide that Marshall had spoken about, the movements in and out. I spent most of my career in the front line, so in a frontline office, either as a worker, a supervisor, or a manager, And one of the things that you may have heard or you may hear when you talk to staff is that they struggle with vacancies at work sites. And I just wanted to point out that when we have an 86% rate of females in our workforce, that sometimes one of those pressures for staff are mat leaves, maternity leaves. And that's often due to some of our inability to fill planned leaves like maternity or retirements until the person has physically left their role. And so often what staff will talk to you about is that they feel that extra pressure, and I think we actually mentioned that in the WAM presentation on Monday, and Donna Bell is here, who presented on that. Some of those pressures around carrying caseload for short-term periods of time can actually be pretty stressful for staff because they've got to pick up those pieces of work while they're waiting for a new colleague, and also are sometimes pretty stressful for our youth, our kids, and our families who see a change in worker. And that isn't necessarily because that we're seeing staff leave our organization, but we're seeing some of those pieces of life that happen, especially when you have a large workforce of females. And although our rate was about 100 mat leaves, I think,
100 a year.
About 100 a year. That might not sound super, super high, but it depends on the office you're in. Because I can attest to, in an office I worked in with Nicole, we had a number of mat leaves, probably more than 10 in 1 year, and that was really hard to manage in terms of just moving caseload. So I just thought I'd mention it as you're meeting with staff over the next few days. If they're talking about some of those pressures, sometimes it's the shorter term of the planned leaves that are really hard for our staff. So in terms of the actual piece on this slide that I wanted to talk about, I wanted to just mention some of the training that we do for our staff. So Catherine talked about how we hire staff and that they come in the door with some different educational backgrounds, and that along those lines we ask for different levels of experience for staff. And so if you're coming in with a BSW, you may have had a practicum, so you've done a social work degree, you've done your practicum within children's services, and you're coming in as a new staff. Or you may be coming in the door with a psychology degree, but you've worked in the field with an agency partner supporting kids and families for a year. All of the people we hire come with great educational training regardless. And their programs are really well suited to help us get staff in the door that, as Catherine described, they're professionals. We're bringing in professional level staff. However, that educational background, even in social work, provides staff with a really good foundation of the field of social work, but child intervention is a pretty technical job. And it's a pretty complex job, as you've been hearing for the past bit of time. And so what we need to do and what we strive to do is to build on those educational components that they learn in school and start to help staff understand some of the technical aspects of the job along the way. And so the first piece of that is our onboarding training. We currently call that delegation training. Staff across the province, when they start working for Children's Services, need to take that training, whether they work in a delegated First Nation or a Child and Family Services office. They are not allowed to. What delegated means is that they can't make day-to-day decisions and assessments on their own until they complete that training. So that training involves 5 weeks of different aspects of the work that they need to learn. So they go through the requirements if they're going to court. They go through the requirements of how you do the work at intake and assessment and meeting with families and planning with families and how you work with Aboriginal communities, for example. And then when they finish that training, their supervisor and that worker would have some conversations around, are they ready to be delegated? And that would allow them to go out to families' homes on their own and to be able to come back and talk to their supervisor about what's going on in that home. But training is really only just a small part of how we learn the technical role of Children's Services staff. There's coaching and mentoring and ongoing learning development that happens alongside of that. But for sure, in terms of our delegation training, we continue to update that on an ongoing basis for current research and evidence. And we also utilize some of the recommendations. And in the package that Sarita mentioned earlier today, you'll certainly see references to training and strengthening some of the pieces that we teach our staff. So those are all aligned into our current training module. Go ahead, Joni. Oh, you're moved on already. So in our presentation on Monday, John and I mentioned training as a large component of the redesign of our system to align with the practice framework principles and the practice approaches and tools that we are using in the field. And we also talked a little bit about some of those specific tasks that we were doing to help us with that, like competency profiles. So as we redesign our training, we're utilizing those competency profiles in different ways than we have. So first and foremost, we know from research, from what staff have told us, and from other evidence, that training staff as they come in the front door is great, but we currently provide our staff with a lot of detailed information right up front. And that isn't necessarily the best way to have staff learn and retain that information. So if I learn in my first or second week how to go to court and work through a trial, I might not actually go to court and be at a trial for several months. It's hard for staff to retain all of that. So the idea of the revamping of our training is to align that with more of a learning pathway approach, where we think about what do workers need to know the first day, the first month, the 7th month, the 18th month, and think about how we can take what we need them to know and space that out, as well as provide them with really intentional coaching and mentoring opportunities. So they learn something in a classroom, they bring it back to their work site, and they practice that with people on site to assist them. So that's the idea of some of the work that we're looking to do and we're on our path in doing. The competency profiles come in because what we've done is redesigned them as well. So we've thought about, instead of the competencies that we have for our staff, which are a foundational HR tool, highlighting everything that a worker needs to know, we've really drilled that down to what's essential. What are the core skills that a children's services worker needs to know in different roles? And then we've really taken a look at how they fall into 3 areas of skill for staff. So what are the competencies and behavioral indicators that staff would come in the door with? So a lot of wanting to work in social work and being good at doing the work that we do comes with who you are, where you grew up, what your worldview is, how you work with kids and families. We also know that they learn lots and lots of things in school, so we want to think about what are those skills they're going to bring from their educational backgrounds, whatever they are. And then finally, we have our technical skills. What do we need to teach them? So how do we teach them to understand how to apply the legislation or the matters to be considered? How do we teach them to fill out forms if we need a form filled out, those kinds of pieces? So those new competency profiles have some really concrete behavioral indicators in them that help us understand what we really need our staff to know and do. We can take those and link them right to those learning objectives for training. So we're getting much more intentional as to what we want to train our staff and when we want to train them and how we're going to support them in the field through the pathway design. The only other thing I'd say on here is that supervisors have been really highlighted as key. That comes from the feedback that we've gained out and about talking to staff. So when I talked about developing the principles of the framework, I talked about going to see about 800 staff. Pretty much in every conversation in those 19 communities, staff talked about the importance of their supervisor in terms of helping them learn how to do the work, supporting them in the work, helping reduce that anxiety that we've talked about today, being that I call it the doubter. I'm not sure what you called it, Peter, but that person who says, convince me, wait a minute, unpack why you think that's what we need to do. The supervisor really plays a key role there. So we really wanted to focus on supervisors. So what we've done in that regard is we've developed a training specifically for supervisors. It outlines practice supervision, so a little bit more than of course, these are important administrative tasks. When you meet with your staff, you ask them how their caseload's going and have they seen their children and, you know, where are things at with their families, what risks and worries do they have, but also really having the time to think about how do you do that reflective practice. So what do you think is going to happen and how have you engaged family and community and what's the barriers to the work that you're doing. So this training really supports staff in thinking about those really critical elements of the work and making space and time to have that practice supervision with staff. There are some other trainings that our staff can take. That one is mandatory for all supervisors and managers. Along the way, we also have some other supervisory skill training that's available to them. And then another key role that sometimes our supervisors play, and sometimes we have people we call practice specialists playing, are really the ones that are out there that understand those new tools, whether that's family finding or signs of safety or just how to use the principles in their work. They aren't carrying caseload typically. Instead, their job is to solely spend time with staff in offices designated for them, just helping them deepen their practice. So it's really around, you want to try using that new format of how you go out and you talk to a family and build a plan. Let me walk you through that. Let's talk about how you would do that. And then the worker would go out and try that out. They'd meet with that person and revisit how'd it go, where they get stuck, how could they work that through next time. So those practice specialists are really essential in terms of helping us think through that, trying to shift the practice and support staff in trying things in different ways. So most of our regional staff have access to a practice specialist across the province. Some have them right in their sites and some have them traveling to different sites. And then for our delegated First Nations, the field support staff that are based out of the ministry office, they support the DFNAs. So I think you've met with some of the field support staff earlier in conversation. And that really is, I think, as much as I need to say on that. I see Joey's moving me right along, so I'll carry on. She's supposed to be my timekeeper as well, so I assume when she's skipping, that means I'm out of time. All I'd add here is, and we've talked about it a number of times today and on Monday, a big part of ongoing learning and development is really being able to create that space for staff to come together and to talk about what's different in their practice and how they're making those changes. So those are things like the policy to practice sessions that we've mentioned before that are available by Zoom, where we can talk about what's our policy, what does that look like with current practice, how does that line up with the principles so they see how it anchors. And we have staff from across the province join us in those presentations. They can view them online if they miss it live. And then we also do things like the community of practice events that we've talked about, where large groups of staff can come together and talk about what's working, what gets in the way, what are they worried about, what do they need, and we use their feedback to help us guide where we're going in terms of the work that we're doing. All right, and then we're also looking to continue to build the cultural understanding framework. This work started in the fall of 2016. And is the goal of the Indigenous cultural understanding framework is to provide a common vision, some guiding principles, and some overarching goals and objectives regarding our consistent application of a learning pathway across our ministry. So all divisions and all levels of staff really having some consistent understanding and training around this area. So we started that work in 2016. And we brought together a group that has scoped out that work and started underway. So right now, the cultural understanding framework is in phase 1 and 2, initiate, build, and plan. So the idea of where we're at is to really take some time to talk to our Indigenous partners. We really know that we can't have a one-way approach to that work and that understanding. We need to really think about developing a framework that's responsive to different communities and different needed learning styles across and different cultures across Canada. So our staff need to have that really broad sense of that. So right now they have been working on developing a framework which should be approved by the end of June. And then there'll be some engagement. So they'll go out to validate if they've got it roughly right, with some implementation planning in fall of September. I'm done.
So I just want to take some time to talk to you about employee engagement and some of the feedback that we've received from child intervention regarding their work in their workplace. I've put in there the official definition of employee engagement, but really what we're talking about is an employee's behavior, approach, feeling, and connection to their work. And there's 2 ways in HR that we measure employee engagement. The first one is the employee engagement survey. The most recent one came out in 2016. And the other piece is focus groups that HR conducted across the province after that survey to validate what we had gleaned out of the results and ask employees what kind of actions they would like to see the department take in order to improve or better their workplaces. So in terms of the survey itself, there were 4 main priorities at a department level that were identified, and these same priorities ended up in child intervention as well. So they're the same. We have confidence in senior leadership, support at work to provide a high level of service, and that one's going to come up a little bit later in the presentation. Meaningful recognition and essential information flows, and that's that communication piece between senior leaders and employees. So those are the 4 department priorities that we went out to staff with to ask them about how can we improve? What is it that we need to do as a department? On the next slide, there is, wanted to put in here child intervention survey results. And just due to time, what I've done is pulled out the 2 indexes that we look at in HR when it comes to employee engagement. And there's a couple things just to think about here is, first of all, only 61% of child intervention workers filled out the survey. So we're missing 40% of feedback from child intervention. The other piece is, this is, as with any survey, it's a snapshot in time. However, it still gives us a really good indication of where we are in terms of employee engagement. So if we look at that engagement outcome index, what that's telling us is 61% of employees agree or strongly agree that they are satisfied with their work, they have pride working for the APS, and they feel valued. And this is really about how they feel towards the work. That is a decrease of 1% from the 2013 employee survey. The other index is the engagement driver index, and what that's telling us is that 65% of employees agree or strongly agree that they are engaged in the workplace, and that the actions that this is about the actions that the department carries out to support employee engagement, and that's around recognition. Am I treated respectfully at work? Do I have career growth opportunities? And do I have high quality supervision? So if you look at those 2, you can see that the department and the APS and child intervention, they're very similar. There's nothing there that we would say, oh, red flag, red flag. However, we would agree that 65% and 61% are not the engagement levels that we would like to see in the department. We would definitely like to see an increase in that, and we know that there's work to be done. And I will let you know, next week our Pulse Employee Engagement Survey is coming out to all employees. So we'll be able to get probably information by the end of July to indicate to us if some of the actions we've put in place have improved the employee engagement over the last year. So in terms of the survey and the focus groups, we were able to go through our focus group input and pull out the child intervention feedback. And so really the employees, when it came to the strengths of child intervention, they feel they are treated respectfully at work, they're satisfied working with the APS, and they have great working relationships with their peers, the people that they work with every day. What I want to focus on more, though, is the opportunities. And this is when we went to employees to say, okay, you've identified these opportunities. Why are these concerns, and how do we address these? So the one that came out quite a bit in our discussions with employees was the negative media and the public perception. We did touch on this a little bit in the earlier presentation, but I want to put some context around that. When something happens that causes negative media or negative public perception, or even negative political focus, employees feel that they are supported at their work site with their peers. They feel supported at their divisional level, so at the child intervention level. Where they're not feeling supported is the department proper and the government as a whole. They don't believe and don't feel that the department or government has their backs when something comes out in the media. Another thing that came out was their workload, and this was more around the complex cases that they're seeing now, and the increase and how it's changed quite a bit. And so they're spending a lot of time working on those complex cases, which is causing the workload to increase. And then wellness. We had lots of feedback on we're suffering. There's things that happen every day at work. It's causing us to burn out. Some of them are going through some traumatic incidents, and it really comes down to What resources are out there? How do I access them? And how does my supervisor support me? The other one I wanted to point out here on this list was around the recruitment of supervisors and managers. We heard loud and clear that we have to do a better job in hiring our supervisors. They want supervisors who understand the work, but who are supportive, who can provide them with advice and are there to just say, how you doing? Are you handling everything okay? So one of the things we've done, we've worked with Kim's group to develop that supervisor competency, and so we can do a better job at hiring those people into the supervisory roles. So in your package, you did receive a copy of our people strategy. This was a strategy that was developed in 2014 that was in response to the 2013 survey results. Now with the new survey in 2016, we have gone and refreshed that and used the feedback from the focus groups and the survey to change our actions and our focus in this people strategy. This is a department-wide focus strategy. All the divisions have or are developing their own engagement plan for employees. And what we've asked them to do, that's to address their specific survey results that they've received, but also make sure you keep in mind to connect it to the larger people strategy so that we're all moving in the same direction. In terms of actions for the people strategy that directly address what we heard from staff, you heard on Monday from Donna regarding the workload assessment model. We're also working on a psychological health and safety framework. This is, it's kind of two-part. One is about, one piece of it is just understanding what's out there to support employees, and also understanding how you can support each other and how managers can support their peers on the work site. So that is something we're working with our employee family assistance provider with, an all-encompassing umbrella approach to psychological health and safety. And then we have the competency profile framework. As I mentioned before, we've been working with Kim's team on developing competencies around the caseworker, the assessor, the supervisor. I think we're working on kinship and adoptions care next. So that, and that framework, again, this is department-wide, so we're building a framework to determine how we identify key roles in the department and build competencies towards those. And then our supervisor manager orientation program. This is not an orientation program to train managers on the technical management supervisor skills. This is more about the soft skills. How do I communicate with my employees? How do I recognize my employees? How do I provide the appropriate support at the work site? So those are some of the key actions that we've been working on with the people strategy this past year. I'll hand it over to Daryl for the financial piece.
Daryl Dankos, I'm the Senior Financial Officer for the Ministry. Just give you some overview of some financial highlights for the Ministry. So what I would point out on this particular page is the administrative spending, or what I would call the corporate costs, are very low, about 3.3%. The vast majority of the budget is spent on the front line of the regional service delivery, where that would be your staff and your services to children. Supplies and services costs of $487 million. In government, what supplies and services mean is not staff and not grants, so basically everything else. So that represents about 64% of our program spending, and a lot of that, $132 million roughly, is tied up in large contract expenses. So when we contract for foster care services or group care services or enhancement services. Grants, we don't do a lot of grants. We have about $8 million in grants, so not much there. And staffing is about a third of our costs, just over a third. So that's, again, majority of that is the frontline delivery. 260 million of the 270 is basically dedicated to that. The next page, we just show sort of our financial results. These are actuals, what we spent over the last several years. What I would highlight again is if you look at the top one, so salary, staffing, and then we've got supplies and services, which is everything besides what we pay for staffing and those grants. And at the bottom there, what I would highlight is program and planning and delivery, which is what I would call our corporate costs. As you can see, they've come down quite a bit from what they were in 13-14. There was some strategic changes there. But the other lines, our investments have been increasing over time, in particular areas like foster care and supports for permanency, which are good news stories because those are least intrusive, best kind of placements. And just in the middle there's a quick note, regional delivery costs, so our services out in the front line are basically at 92% of the annual expense in this child intervention area. A few reasons for our costs changing, our investments changing. The economic downturn obviously has an impact on families and the ability to care for their children. Population growth in general, we are seeing, and I think it was mentioned earlier, some complex cases requiring additional investments. A few years ago, there was expanded eligibility for financial assistance from 22 to 24. So the children can be young adults and still receive services from us. Last thing I would highlight again, and I said this a couple of seconds ago, there are some good news stories in these increased investments, and it would be things like more children reaching permanency and getting into the foster care placements, which are less intrusive. That's it for me.
Thank you very much. Start with Patty.
Thank you for the presentations. They're really informative. I just want to talk a little bit about, it was mentioned that the evidence-based training regime that's happening and going to be implemented, and drawing on Tyler's comments earlier about strength in community, Dr. Cho saying that, death reviews don't generally pick up that data. I would like to query about how we define evidence-based, and remind the panel that science has been an instrument of colonization since the very beginning. Science was used to prop up the civilizing mission. Everything from doing medical experiments on Indigenous children all the way to this recent movement afoot to discredit the TRC report as not evidence-based or not scientific. So there's some problems with science. From my perspective, how we research, imagine, and measure risk is still influenced by colonization, by these colonial assumptions that lurk underneath our scientific enterprise. And when I look at that training schedule, I know that you're moving towards cultural training, but I would wonder if understanding colonial bias in social work practice should not be foundational training at the beginning, up front, for people to unpack colonial bias. That is not something that I think any elder, leader, First Nations leader, Métis leader would say, wait a minute, we got to weigh in on that. I think there's lots of research on colonial bias in practice that could be baked right into the foundational training, maybe not day 1, but maybe day 5. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I'm going to Graham.
I'm going to go back to just some of the statistics you showed about your frontline workforce. And I have a few questions that aren't really answered in the slides. And if you can't provide them for me, just say so. I was wondering first, what is the demographic of your workers, like ethnic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds? And also, have there been any that have been involved in the intervention system as younger people, or have had children of their own that have been involved in the intervention system and subsequently became frontline workers themselves? And then after you give me those answers, I just have a quick follow-up in relation to recruitment of supervisors.
We don't have demographic information, like ethnic information like that. It's a gap that's been identified, but our HR information system just isn't equipped to handle that right now. So we don't have that. In terms of experience with the child intervention system, I don't have that either. I don't don't know if it's just not in the HR system and then employees might disclose it later, but it's not available for these sorts of statistics.
Is there an active process when you're doing recruitment? Because we see this, best examples within police forces from time to time of actively trying to seek diversity within your hiring practices.
Yeah. So I'll just try to answer anecdotally the question you had, because we don't currently capture sort of racial origin or cultural heritage of staff. I think for a variety of historical reasons that may not be relevant anymore. So looking at that, what I can tell you is that more and more, if the question is about how many Indigenous staff we have, because that tends to be at the center of the question, I would say that number is increasing. Do I think that is representative of the number of kids we have in care? Nope, it is definitely not. And do we have workers and staff who have their own histories? We for sure do. We don't ask them to disclose that because that's really up to them to decide to disclose. But for sure, lots of people get into social work because they want to change the system and they want to help. So I would say there's a fair number.
Okay. And then going in relation to the supervisors and your managers, does the gender tend to match what you see from your frontline employee demographic? And the second question I have in relation to that is when you're hiring supervisors, because I'm seeing this concern that's coming from some of your stats in relation to recruitment being an issue, is there a lot of internal hiring? Is it easy for people to make lateral moves within the organization, or do you hire externally for those processes?
So I think I'll start, and anyone can jump in, but in terms of your first question around supervisors, I'm thinking what you're asking is, are most of our supervisors female because we have a predominantly female workforce? Would that be?
Does the gender demographic match that you see from your frontline workers?
Yeah, primarily.
Okay.
I don't know if you guys would disagree with me.
I mean, I don't have the exact numbers with me. I think at the supervisor level, it matches fairly closely. Unfortunately, the higher you go through management, the less it matches.
Change. Yeah, for sure.
I'm sure we can get a breakdown that way for you if you'd like.
Yeah, we can certainly get a breakdown for you for that.
And then in relation to the recruitment process?
So it is and we didn't really cover it in the slides, but I think it's a good question. When we talked about our HSW 5s or caseworker being a bit of an entry role, because Children's Services is quite a technical job, we typically bring people along through those different promotions based on their experience in our system. So to move from a caseworker to a supervisor, you have to have done casework for a period of time because you need to build that level of depth of skill in order to then supervise a team. I don't know if you probably have some other things you add.
I'm going to go to Tyler and then to those on the phones if there's any questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Just one comment and a question, I guess. Really, I just want to again reinforce Patty's point about the training around colonial biases, and especially at the senior level. That's where I think you really need to emphasize that training, and then it sort of filters on down. So I just want to again re-emphasize strongly that point. The second point, second question I have is, I'm glad the finance guys here. Is around the cultural framework. You mentioned that it was going to be implemented in 2018. And so I have a lot of experience working with the federal government and a lot of frustration working with the federal government, especially around programs and services. And they always come out and they announce this big program, we're doing all these great things, this big thing is coming out, and then they pull the rug out from under you in a year or two. Or there is very little investment in the program. So I guess my question is, what kind of investment is being made into this cultural framework? I mean, some real investment, real resources, not just lip service.
You want to start us off?
So, part of my answer is going to be I don't have an answer for you. that is being led by our Indigenous Community Connections area. But what I will say is that we may have suggested that that there isn't cultural understanding work underway right now. It is around creating some standardized expectation. And you're so right, Tyler. Not just, we oftentimes say, well, frontline workers need this or that. Well, no, the people that make the rules need that too. So well taken. So the framework is really to say, in a pathway, kind of a parallel pathway to actually learning the technical skills, how do you create experiences, exposure, opportunity to understand the communities that you're serving, including First Nations communities? So there's lots underway already. One of the things that we've done, that we've invested a fair amount of money into over the last few years, is creating reference to Cree areas, Dene areas with their elders in those communities. A series of 5-day experiential learning where staff are absolutely immersed for 5 days, which, I mean, to carve 5 days off of a worker's time who has a caseload is fairly significant. For them to go through ceremony, to sit in circles, to hear about some of the sacred teachings and reflect on what that looks like in their practice. So we have that available. Can we check off a box that everybody in the organization has taken that yet? No. Same with things like the blanket exercise, some of the other training that are developed by First Nations communities that our staff participate in. So what we're trying to do is create some rigor to say, if you work in this organization, you're going to be carried along this path. And some of those things are going to happen in First Nations communities, because you need to meet communities and you need to meet people and develop relationships. It's not simply, training is almost a misnomer. What will that total cost be, the expenditure be over time? I don't know, because we have it funded in a variety of ways, the way it currently stands. But it's a fair question, and it's probably a fair accountability of ours over time to say this is how much we invest. I just want to speak to the evidence. So when we say evidence, it's not simply scientific evidence. The TRC recs, when we're looking at practice and staff training, we consider those recs pretty significantly. And there's some really clear recs 1 to 9 related to child welfare and what they need to know. So that's some of the evidence we use as well.
Before we go on to the next question, I just wanted to do a time check. We've only got about 15 minutes left before we're scheduled to adjourn, and we haven't even gotten into our facilitated piece with Damien. But I still got a list of people who want to ask questions. So does the panel feel that they would really like to continue with the question and answer piece on this? Okay, then we will do that. And I'll go to the phones. Is there anybody on the phone? With a question?
It's David Swan. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, David.
Yes, David. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. It was one of the key areas that I thought we needed to examine with the corporate surveys, which prior to 2014 were pretty dramatically unsatisfactory. And I was very pleased to see some of the changes that occurred after 2014 with some of the changes you've made to the organizational culture, priority on relationships, recognition of staff, some of the issues that are soft, as it's described, but are making a significant difference, obviously, in some of the retention of staff and the importance of teamwork and removing the culture of fear that we've heard so much about over the years. So mine are just comments to say I see progress here and encouraging steps. So thank you very much.
Anyone else with questions on the phone? Okay, no one's jumping in. I will go to Peter.
Thank you. There's 2 areas I'd like to explore with you. The first is the death review processes have raised the question on several occasions of specialized training. And I've often felt that an impossible task. You can't have somebody who's a specialist in mental health. You can't have somebody who's a specialist in addiction. You can't have somebody who's a specialist in interpersonal violence. But I think there's sort of enough training that you know you need some specialist. And then where are those specialist services, particularly as you get outside the urban centers? How is that getting addressed?
Thinking about specialized services. So most of the presentation pieces that we talked about today were regarding our training that all our new staff take, so our delegation training, and then some of our practice training that all staff take. We do have some specialist training, specifically for the 15%. So we go back to Bruce's data around 85-15. We know that we need to use a much more forensic response for that 15%. So those are kids at imminent risk. We talked about the little ones under 3, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse. So for those children and the type of investigations that we're doing, we have began to partner with the CACs. I don't know if the Child Advocacy Centers. I'm assuming you've heard a little bit about them before me. I apologize if not, because they are coming together with a hub to support kids and families that have experienced those sorts of significant trauma. Not all of those kids are involved with children's services. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, other things happen to children that families then respond to appropriately, and we don't even really have much of a role. But where we do, we're really highlighting utilizing that collective, and there are some definite specialized training for that underway. Jump in a few others.
So Peter, if your question's about our internal staff and their capacity and specialization.
Yes, so I'm not actually in favor or proposing that they become specialists. It's that level of training that allows you to recognize interpersonal violence, addiction, etc. Yeah.
So those are modules that come sort of, there's some baked into delegation training. I still use the old terminology, but then depending on where you work, you may require training that's more specialized in particular areas. And so, for instance, where staff are predominantly working with young people, with youth, they may be trained on some approaches that are specifically related to harm reduction and young people, for example. What we need is our staff to know enough that they know when they don't know something.
Yes.
That makes any sense, and learn how to be hard advocates. Because if we spent all of our time in topical training, there would be nobody doing the work. Having said that, we are right now looking at what our response is, for example, on the issues related to opioids. And we need to make sure that we have a great general understanding of a new phenomena. So that's kind of how we tackle those versus creating real hard specialization in any particular area, because that just, first of all, for some staff who are registered social workers, they would be treading into territory that's beyond their scope of practice as a professional and wouldn't want to do that. And secondly, we probably couldn't create that kind of coverage or expectation that we would have that knowledge for all cases.
Okay, so we're in agreement on that.
Yes.
So what is the step then to have those specialist services available as the case requires it, particularly outside of urban Alberta? So your workers identified person X has an opioid dependency problem and they happen to live in Peace River. So it's that linkage I'm trying to understand.
I can give you an example with multicultural populations if that might help. And if not, then we can back up. But we've developed an intercultural understanding training based on staff requests. So again, it's probably some of my technical language. When I talk about evidence-based, that evidence for me often comes from the field saying, I don't have enough experience and I need to know something, not necessarily outsiders. And that's really what happened there. And most of our newcomers have settled in some very specific communities. So we have a table that comes together definitely has some urban representation because lots of our newcomers settle in Edmonton and Calgary, but there certainly are pockets in Fort McMurray and Lac La Biche and other little places or smaller places. So that table came together and helped guide the development of a training utilizing some local experts. So we utilize some agencies that really support cultures that are new to Alberta, and how we could really help support them in that bridging, as well as some academics that had some understanding of how to develop some curriculum that would fit for that type of client and that type of experience. So that training is developed and ready, and you can take it. But as Joni suggested, if you are working in an office where you have a large population of newcomers, you may take that training. But if you're in St. Paul, you might not. However, you might have a worker who then gets a newcomer into their office and to their caseload, and they're kind of saying, wow, how does that work? So if they want to take the training, of course it's available to them, but they can also access that table, and that table of professionals that has child intervention experience, disability services experience, newcomers and settlement experience from a federal level that can really also just help them navigate what they need to do to support that client. So we get together every few months, and people can bring those pieces to the table. So it's a little bit of a reach out if they don't need the whole training, but they just need someone like a hub and spoke to help them through one file, as well as they can access more training as if they want. I don't know if that's helpful, Peter.
Well, it begins in the presentations, for example, from the Métis community, 2 weeks ago. They spoke a lot about that problem combined with problems with access. And so we've got frontline workers in more remote communities, less capacity, perhaps in terms of because they've got these more remote complex cases, and they're talking to us about gaps in services and a lack of that support system. So how does that get addressed?
So, it's around the how do you get the services for the family if it's not the worker, but there's other...
A, knowing you need it.
Knowing you need it.
B, then going to find it.
It is definitely more difficult in rural. That's where I worked. My whole field experience was in rural Alberta. And it's more difficult, and sometimes it's easier. And what I mean by that is those local people, if they stay in the community, you know them. You have a personal relationship with them already, so there's ability to move sort of families up on the queue sometimes. And sometimes you're bringing people in and paying for that. We did that a lot, so we had itinerant services and we would bring people in. And sometimes, depending on the nature of their need, it's so specialized that we need to bring families to those supports instead. So, for example, inpatient mental health supports, you just don't have those in local communities, and so we do have to figure out ways that we can support families to remain engaged but get the services they need. And if that means paying for the family to be there, or paying for childcare for the other children while the family can be with the young person that we're concerned about, then those are the kinds of things that we do. It is always challenging in rural, and a lot of times I think somebody mentioned that rural positions in some professions are seen as stepping stones to getting back to the urban area. So we used to tease that we would try to find some of these women farmers to marry and stick around, because we struggle with people coming for a bit, getting experience, and when you have experience, your foot is in the door. The second piece we know now in rural is that if you have, for example, Indigenous families from communities that are in that area, there's a whole bunch of resources we would have never considered in the past as being specialized, but in fact are exactly what those families need. And so it is also a matter of reaching out to those communities in a more intentional way, but that also takes time and relationships.
Heather.
I'll try to be really quick. I just want to go back to the opportunities on the focus groups and talking about caseload workloads, burnout, and wellness. I think I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're exploring with EAP expansions around how we can support frontline workers. And I guess my feedback to that would be, coming from frontline, many frontline workers don't like to engage with EAP because they're not allowed to talk about what's actually creating the stress, right? Like, they've had a bad experience on a file, they can't really talk about the file, so they just have to talk about their feelings. And Nicole and I have been talking to some different groups, and I know like Edmonton Police Services, Edmonton Firefighters, they have like a mentorship program that they actually train their own staff at their neighborhood centers to be those one-on-one peer supports. And they'll actually call people at home to check in and do that. So as you're exploring these supports and options, looking at our first responders programs and what they're doing may be an opportunity to create some great successes with just within the neighborhood centers, because they've had great morale development based on this pilot that they've done now, I guess 6 years with EPS. So anyway, that's it.
And actually, if I could just add to that, because you've touched on something that we are looking at. One of the things we're working on is possibly identifying a counseling resource in each region that is familiar with child intervention and the work that they do, that employees can go to. That's separate from EFAP. There's also the opportunity within EFAP, and employees can. My understanding is it's a counselor. It's privacy. They can speak about their cases with that counselor. I could be wrong, but we are looking at several different resources that can support employees in each of the regions.
But I think that speaks to the culture in the sense of like people not feeling safe enough to be able to have those conversations outside of their network of like their neighborhood center. And so being able to know that, hey, I can go down the hall and talk to Sally because they have this training and they'll support me and I can talk about that family, I think might create a little bit of a, freedom to actually talk about some of that stuff that we tend to bottle and then put us on medical leave stuff.
And absolutely, and a lot of times in the regions, the only people available to speak to you are the ones that you're working cases with, and you don't want to have that connection, right? So there's a number of different resources we're looking at, so thank you for that.
Okay, last question, Bruce.
Great, no problem. Two quick questions, and one's building on Peter's. One is focusing on me getting clear on how budgets are allocated by offices. So Calgary, really big office, Wainwright, very small. Is it determined by child population? Is it determined by previous year's caseload? How do you determine the amount of money that gets allocated for an office?
Right. Let's start at the beginning. So, Treasury Board basically decides how much we get. Then we look more at what we've spent historically, what the cases are in a particular area, how many workers they have, and that's how we sort of determine the budgets for that year. We do run it through, doesn't just come from finance, it runs through the program areas as well for them to evaluate and make sure that we've got it reasonable given what they think is going to happen in those particular offices.
Okay. Any potential errors that you see in approaching it that way? And I'm not coming at it with a end result. I don't know of any, but
because there's some guesswork involved, there's always the potential, because we have to figure out really early, like we're basically doing it in January and figuring out for the next year, well, do we think we're going to have the same makeup of people, cases, services in a particular area? So there's always room for error, if that's what you're saying, as far as budget allocation and getting it quite right.
It's more questioning it, and I guess when I think about rural communities, for example, the budget per child living in that community, would it be similar to Wainwright? Probably not, than it would be to Calgary, that has a much higher child population. And how do you figure that out?
You guys can chime in if you have anything different to say on this, but it would be similar, except for there would be some maybe noticeable differences. Some of the larger regions, like Edmonton and Calgary, we have a more predominance of higher cost cases, so that may skew it a bit. But in general, yeah, it should be relatively the same.
Okay.
All right. You had another question?
No, just the second
Okay.
part to it. So the other thing I'm curious about, and I know that your funding doesn't, address any funding for delegated First Nation agencies. Do we have a sense about how the kind of per region, per child population cost in a site compares to a DFNA funding, for example? And are we clear on the difference?
Yeah, no, and I would answer that, no, we aren't quite clear from my
you were not?
perspective. Not clear.
Okay.
It's not something we've done a comparison on,
Okay.
and it is a little bit different, as you pointed out, that
Yeah.
the services on the First Nations versus what we offer can vary. We do work closely with the federal government for the cases normally resident on reserve that we serve, and have an arrangement with them where we charge back some costs and things like that. But
Yeah.
as far as comparison of what we're delivering versus DFNA, I don't recall that ever being done on a financial level.
Would it be possible for the panel at some point in time to get, and I don't expect an answer here or a quick fix, but to get a sense of what that disparity would be here in Alberta? Estimates at best that we could use to help our own thinking about it and our own recommendations that come from here?
What comes to mind is we would need to request that information from a delegated First Nations agency or two that would like to share that information with us. So, that's a consideration. Could it be done if there was the time and there was the willingness? It probably could be done. But we'd have to think that through because it does require
Joni,
them to share their budgets.
Couldn't we use the funding formula as a rough guesstimate? Because we know what that funding formula is from the federal government. The DFNAs were open about that at one of their meetings. So it wouldn't be perfect, but could it give us a guide?
I'm in this field because I didn't do that great in math. I had friends actually help me finish one of my. I had to take a by correspondence
But we've got this really brilliant financial guy here.
Yeah, we can try and take a look at that. I'm not familiar with what you're describing, but we can take a look at it and see, but it would be subject to significant potential error, yeah. We could take a look.
Because it can relate to a well-funded, well-resourced DFNA that's, just outside of Calgary, for example, versus another one that might be in the northern reaches and it's exacerbated by distance.